The secret had stayed buried for 23 years until my daughter's pale blue eyes, her father's eyes, stared into mine and demanded the truth. I never thought I'd have to explain how I buried a man's sins to protect her, how I carried the weight of his darkness so she could walk in light. But some secrets refused to stay buried, and this one clawed its way out the day Cassidy found the locked metal box in our attic. Rain lashed against the windows of our Connecticut colonial that afternoon, the sky as dark as the truth I was about to spill. Lightning flashed, illuminating Cassidy's face in harsh strokes as she stood in my bedroom doorway, clutching the weathered photograph I'd hidden away for decades. Her hands trembled. Mine were perfectly still. I'd been preparing for this moment longer than she'd been alive. "Why does this man look exactly like me?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "And why is his name scratched out?" The photograph showed a younger version of myself, hair blown by ocean wind, standing beside a handsome man with Cassidy's same striking eyes, high cheekbones, and dimpled smile. I'd scratched his face with scissor points 100 times, but could never bring myself to destroy it completely. Evidence, insurance, reminder. I was never sure which. "Mom?" Cassidy's voice rose, tears welling. "Who is he? Every time I've asked about my father, you said he died before I was born, that he was a good man who would have loved me. But this," she thrust the photo toward me, "this was hidden in a locked box, with court documents and newspaper clippings about some murder trial." The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly between us. 23 years of carefully constructed protection threatened to collapse in an instant. "His name was Daniel Blackwood," I said finally, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "And yes, he was your biological father." "Was?" Her face paled. "So he is dead?" I looked at my beautiful daughter, Harvard-educated, compassionate, trusting, the perfect combination of Daniel's striking features and my resilience. I'd spent her entire life sheltering her from the shadow that would have otherwise defined her. "Daniel Blackwood isn't dead, Cassidy," I said, each word feeling like glass in my throat. "He's serving 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security prison in Colorado." The photograph slipped from her fingers, floating to the hardwood floor like a leaf. Her legs gave way next, and she slid down the door frame until she was sitting, staring at me with those piercing blue eyes that had always reminded me of him. Eyes I'd taught myself to love on her face while hating them on his. "For what?" she barely whispered. The familiar nightmare images flashed through my mind. Blood-spattered walls, the detective's grim face as he showed me photographs, newspaper headlines screaming about the charming professor who'd murdered 3 young women. "For things I've spent your whole life protecting you from," I answered, moving toward her slowly. "For crimes that have nothing to do with who you are. You lied to me my entire life." Each word fell between us like a stone. "I did," I admitted, kneeling before her. "I rebuilt our lives so completely that sometimes I almost believed the story myself. That your father was an architect who died in an accident before you were born. That we moved from Seattle to start fresh because of grief, not because I was running from reporters and horrified whispers." Thunder rattled the windows as Cassidy looked up at me, her face transforming from shock to something harder. 23 years, Mom. You had 23 years to tell me the truth, and I would have given anything for 23 more, I said, reaching for her hand, which she pulled away. You deserved a life where you weren't the murderer's daughter, where people didn't look at you and wonder if you had his... I couldn't finish. His what? His evil? His darkness? Her voice rose. Did you think I'd turn out like him if I knew? No, I said firmly. Never that. But others would have wondered. They would have watched you, waiting for signs. You would have grown up under a microscope of suspicion and fear. Cassidy pushed herself up, steadying against the wall. I need to know everything. Not the version you think I can handle. Everything. I nodded slowly, knowing this moment had always been inevitable. The box had been my insurance, my evidence, my archive of the truth, even as I prayed she'd never find it. But Cassidy had always been too smart, too curious, too much like me. Where do you want me to start? I asked, though I already knew. The beginning, she said, eyes narrowing. And don't leave anything out. As another crack of lightning split the sky, I gestured for her to follow me downstairs. Some stories needed to be told sitting down, with something stronger than tea. Some truths were too heavy to bear standing. I met your father in Seattle in the spring of 1999, I began, as we descended the stairs. each step taking me back to a past I'd locked away. I was 26, working as a librarian at the university where he taught psychology. He was brilliant, charismatic, and I believed kind. What I didn't tell her yet was how completely he'd fooled everyone, how the man who'd charmed me with poetry and morning coffee had hidden a monster behind his perfect smile, how I'd been carrying his secrets long before I carried his child, and how I'd discovered, too late, that loving Daniel Blackwood had been the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, though back then I was Eleanor Winters. I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, raised by a father who believed in books, and a mother who believed in second chances. Their unwavering faith in the goodness of people shaped me into someone who always looked for the best in others, a quality that would later nearly destroy me. I moved to Seattle in 1998 with a master's degree in library science and dreams of a quiet, meaningful life surrounded by literature and rainy days. The University of Washington Library became my sanctuary, a place where I cataloged not just books, but my own careful plans for the future. I lived in a small apartment in Queen Anne, with a view of the Space Needle from my fire escape, where I'd sit with tea and classics on Sunday mornings. My life was organized, predictable, and mine. Then Daniel Blackwood walked into the reference section on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1999, looking for obscure psychology journals for his research. He had a voice that could make academic citations sound like poetry, and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Distinguished at 36, he moved through the world with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. "The library closes in 15 minutes, I'd told him that first day, finding him still buried in research as I made my final rounds. He'd looked up, surprised, as if emerging from a different world. "I've lost track of time completely," he said, then smiled. "Though I can't think of a better place to be trapped overnight." Something fluttered in my chest, the first warning I ignored. Daniel returned the next day with coffee. Library fuel, he called it, and questions about archival systems that led to conversations about favorite novels, which became discussions of art exhibitions and obscure films. Before I understood what was happening, I was falling in love with his mind, his perspectives, his attention. "You see the world differently, Eleanor," he told me one evening as we walked through a spring downpour, sharing an umbrella. "You find meaning in details others overlook." What I didn't find meaning in were the red flags. How he charmed everyone but kept them at a calculated distance. How he sometimes watched people with a detached curiosity that, in retrospect, was more clinical than compassionate. How he never talked about his past in Illinois, beyond vague references to a difficult childhood. We married that December in a small ceremony at a historic Seattle courthouse. My parents flew in from Massachusetts, concerned about the whirlwind romance but warming to Daniel's charm and apparent devotion. His side of the aisle remained conspicuously empty, another detail I rationalized away. "Family is complicated," he'd said. "I'd rather focus on the family we'll build together." We bought a craftsman-style house in a neighborhood filled with professors and young families. I reduced my hours at the library as Daniel's career flourished. He published papers on the psychology of violence and trauma that earned him academic recognition. Invitations to speak at conferences filled our refrigerator door. I was proud of him, proud to be the one he came home to. "You ground me, Ellie," he would say, kissing my forehead. "In a world of chaos and darkness, you're the light I follow home." I believed him. I believed every word. When I discovered I was pregnant in early 2001, Daniel's reaction was complex. A flash of something like fear quickly masked by joy. "A little girl," he predicted, placing his hand on my still flat stomach. "With your kindness and my curiosity." The pregnancy was difficult. Severe morning sickness kept me homebound for months. Daniel grew distant, working late, traveling more. I told myself it was the pressure of his growing career, the impending responsibility of fatherhood. When I confronted him about his absence, his explanations were always reasonable, his apologies seemingly sincere. "This research could change how we understand predatory behavior," he'd explain. "I'm trying to build a better world for our child." The irony of those words still burns. Cassidy was born on a cold October night in 2001. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and eyes that even then were unmistakably her father's. Daniel held her with careful tenderness, studying her features with an intensity that I mistook for paternal awe. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." For a few months, we were a family. Daniel took a sabbatical to help with the baby. He'd rock Cassidy for hours, speaking to her in the same thoughtful tones he used for his lectures. I'd watch them, heart full, believing we'd created something beautiful together. Then the first girl disappeared. Emily Chen, a 19-year-old sophomore, vanished after leaving the psychology building late one evening in February 2002. Her disappearance dominated local news, prompted campus-wide safety meetings. Daniel attended them all, offering insights on predatory behavior, speaking with authority about victim psychology. "It's likely someone she knew," he told me one night as we watched the news coverage. "These crimes are rarely committed by strangers." 2 weeks later, they found Emily's body in a wooded area north of the city. The details were kept from the public, but the campus mourned. Daniel volunteered to counsel Emily's friends, staying late after his regular office hours to help the traumatized students. "You're a good man," I told him, touched by his dedication. He looked at me strangely then, a flash of something I couldn't read crossing his face before he smiled. "I just want to help," he said. A month later, Zoe Martinez disappeared. Then, Kimberly Watson. With each missing girl, Daniel became more involved in the campus response, more visible in the community efforts. He gave interviews to local news stations about the psychological impact of fear on the student body. He started a support group for friends of the victims. And at home, he grew increasingly erratic. Some nights he was the attentive father and husband. Others, he'd lock himself in his office until dawn. I found him once, standing over Cassidy's crib at 3 a.m, just watching her sleep with an expression I still can't describe. "She has my eyes," he'd said without looking up. My exact eyes. Something in his tone raised the hair on my arms. I started noticing other things then. Late-night showers, muddy shoes hidden in the back of the closet, a burner phone I found while doing laundry that he claimed was for research purposes, the careful logs of his movements he kept in a journal, which he said was to establish patterns for an upcoming paper. Then there were the campus rumors, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, concerned glances from colleagues. I overheard a librarian friend say, "Always the charismatic ones you have to watch," before noticing me and changing the subject. The day the police came was ordinary, May 15th, 2002. Sunny, warm. I was in the backyard with 7-month-old Cassidy, teaching her to feel the grass between her tiny fingers. Daniel was inside, preparing for a summer session class. The heavy knock on the door changed everything. I watched through the kitchen window as Daniel spoke with 2 detectives on our porch. His posture remained perfect, his gestures measured. When he invited them inside, his expression betrayed nothing. 2 hours later, I watched them lead my husband away in handcuffs. "It's a misunderstanding," he called to me calmly as they guided him toward the police car. "Take care of Cassidy. I'll be home tonight." He never came home again. The evidence was overwhelming. So overwhelming that sometimes I wonder how I never saw it myself. The detectives returned the next day with a search warrant and grim expressions. "Mrs. Blackwood, is there somewhere you and the baby can stay?" Detective Lisa Morales asked. Her dark eyes filled with a compassion that terrified me. "Why?" I asked, clutching Cassidy to my chest. "What are you looking for?" "We can't discuss the details of an ongoing investigation," her partner, Detective Wilson, said. "But based on evidence recovered from your husband's campus office, we need to conduct a thorough search of your home." I called my friend Rebecca, who came immediately to help me pack some essentials. As we left, dozens of officers in evidence gear were entering our home. Neighbors watched from their porches. Whispers followed us down the street. "What's happening, Ellie?" Rebecca asked as she drove us to her apartment. "I don't know," I said, though a terrible suspicion was forming. "They arrested Daniel yesterday. He said it was a misunderstanding." Rebecca's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "There's something on the news," she said quietly. "About Daniel. They're saying he..." She glanced at Cassidy sleeping in her car seat. "We should wait until we get home to talk about it." The headlines were explicit. University professor arrested in connection with student disappearances. Daniel's faculty photograph stared back at me from every local news channel. Reporters had already unearthed his academic focus on trauma and violence, spinning theories about a psychology expert who crossed the line from studying predators to becoming one. "This is insane," I said, pacing Rebecca's living room. "Daniel is intense, yes, distant sometimes. But this? He helps victims. He counsels trauma survivors. Rebecca looked at me with pity. Ellie, they found things. In his office. What things? I demanded. She hesitated. Personal items belonging to the missing girls, hidden in a locked cabinet behind psychology journals. My legs gave out. Rebecca caught me before I hit the floor. There must be an explanation, I whispered. But even as I said it, pieces were falling into place. His late nights, the showers, the mud, the phone, the strange intensity when he looked at Cassidy. The detectives came to Rebecca's apartment that evening. I'd put Cassidy to bed in a makeshift crib and was sitting in numb silence when they knocked. Mrs. Blackwood, Detective Morales began gently. I'm sorry, but we need to ask you some difficult questions. I don't know anything, I said immediately. Whatever you think Daniel did, I had no idea. We believe you, she said, and something in her tone made me look up. But what we found in your home today, you need to prepare yourself. They showed me photographs of a hidden compartment in our basement, behind the water heater. Inside, they discovered a locked box containing trophies, jewelry, student IDs, and more disturbing items I still cannot bring myself to name. They'd found journals detailing fantasies so violent I vomited when Detective Wilson read excerpts. The worst part, Detective Morales said, watching me carefully, is that he kept records. Detailed records, Eleanor. Dates, times, methodologies. He documented everything like the academic he was. Stop, I begged. Please stop. We need to know if you ever suspected. No, I shouted, then lowered my voice, remembering Cassidy sleeping in the next room. No, never. I would have turned him in myself. I would have taken Cassidy and run. Detective Morales nodded, seeming to accept my horror as genuine. There's something else, she said, exchanging a look with her partner. In one of the journals, he wrote about you and Cassidy. My blood froze. He wrote that Cassidy was his legacy, Detective Wilson said, his voice gentler than before. That someday she would carry on his work, because she had his eyes, his blood, his nature. I felt something break inside me, something fundamental that could never be repaired. Not only had Daniel betrayed our marriage, betrayed humanity with his monstrous acts, but he had seen our innocent daughter as an extension of his depravity. He also wrote, Detective Morales continued hesitantly, that you were his perfect cover, that your goodness and normalcy provided the ideal facade. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just that Daniel was a monster, it was that he had selected me, cultivated me, married me, precisely because I would make him appear normal. My love, my trust, my entire life with him had been a calculated component of his disguise. Everything I thought we had built together was a lie. Every moment I treasured had been to him another brushstroke in his camouflage. Every time he told me he loved me, he had really been saying, "You are useful to me." I had not been his wife, I had been his prop, and he wanted our daughter to follow in his footsteps. That night, after the detectives left, I sat beside Cassidy's makeshift crib watching her sleep. Her tiny hands were curled into fists, her breathing soft and even. In the dim light, her features were all innocence. No hint of the man whose DNA she carried. "You are nothing like him," I whispered fiercely. "Nothing, and no one will ever make you feel that you are." In that moment, I made my decision. Daniel Blackwood would have no claim to our daughter. His name, his crimes, his very existence would be erased from our lives. I would rebuild us from scratch, somewhere far from Seattle, far from the shadow of what he had done. Rebecca found me still sitting there at dawn, my face tear-streaked but resolved. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Disappear," I said. "Change our names. Start over where no one knows us as the wife and daughter of the psychology professor killer." "You can't just run, Ellie," she said, sitting beside me. "There will be a trial. They'll need your testimony. I'll do what I have to legally," I said. "But the second I can, I'm taking my daughter away from this nightmare." The betrayal wasn't over. In the days that followed, I discovered more lies. Daniel had a previous identity in Illinois, had changed his name after allegations at another university were buried. There had been signs before, patterns, warnings that institutions had ignored. He had perfected his facade long before meeting me. And then came the media onslaught. Reporters camped outside Rebecca's apartment. Tabloids offered money for my story. Talk shows speculated about what kind of woman marries a killer without noticing. Old friends gave interviews describing Daniel as intense but brilliant, and me as sweet but naive. The final betrayal came in a letter Daniel sent from jail, perfectly coherent, utterly remorseless. "Ellie," he wrote, "when they ask you about us, about me, remember that you never really knew me. No one did. That was the point. Take care of our little legacy. Nurture what's in her blood. You'll see it emerge eventually. My eyes don't lie." I burned the letter in Rebecca's kitchen sink, watching his words turn to ash, vowing that Cassidy would never know the poison he had tried to plant. 3 days later, I testified before a grand jury, describing our life together with clinical detachment. I handed over every letter, every photograph, every gift he had ever given me. I answered their questions mechanically, already separated from the woman who had loved Daniel Blackwood. That woman was dead now, killed by the truth. In her place stood a mother with a single focus, to protect her daughter from the legacy of a monster, not by acknowledging his darkness, but by denying his very existence in our new life. It was the first secret of many I would keep in the coming years. Reinvention requires sacrifice. This was my first lesson in our new life. After Daniel's indictment, I legally changed our names. Eleanor and Cassidy Blackwood disappeared, replaced by Eleanor and Cassidy Mitchell, my mother's maiden name, a link to the family that stood by me when the world was falling apart. I sold our Seattle house in a private sale, accepting far less than it was worth to avoid real estate listings and public records. I emptied our joint accounts before they could be frozen as evidence. My parents helped us relocate to Brookfield, Connecticut, a town small enough to be intimate, but close enough to New York City that newcomers weren't unusual. They found us a modest colonial with a garden for Cassidy to grow up in, and my father, a retired school principal, used old connections to secure me a position as the town library's children's coordinator. "You can start fresh here, Ellie," my mother said, as she helped me unpack Cassidy's things in her new nursery. "No one needs to know about Daniel. No one will ever know," I said, more to myself than to her. "Especially not Cassidy." My mother paused, a tiny dress still in her hands. "Never? You don't think someday she'll have questions about her father?" "She'll have answers," I said firmly, "just not the true ones." That night, after my parents left, I sat in our empty living room crafting Daniel's replacement, an architect named Thomas Mitchell, who died in a car accident before Cassidy was born. I created him in exquisite detail, where he went to school, how we met, his favorite books, his dream of designing sustainable homes. I practiced speaking about him in the past tense, injecting the right amount of lingering grief into my voice when I mentioned my late husband. I collected photographs of strangers from thrift store frames and estate sales. A handsome dark-haired man with kind eyes became Thomas in our carefully curated family album. I wrote myself love letters from him, dated before Cassidy's birth, to store in a memory box. I practiced his signature until I could forge it convincingly on Cassidy's birth certificate. The architecture of our lie became as detailed and structurally sound as any building Thomas might have designed. While I constructed this fiction, the truth played out 3,000 miles away. Daniel's trial began in Seattle 6 months after our departure. I testified via video conference, a concession the prosecutor made to my traumatized state and need to care for an infant. I watched Daniel in the video feed, sitting calmly at the defense table in a blue suit, looking more like a professor observing an academic debate than a man facing multiple murder charges. He never looked at the camera, never tried to see me. His only acknowledgement of our connection was a small smile when the prosecutor referenced his infant daughter, now relocated with her mother, a proprietary smile that chilled me to the bone. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge called him a predator who used his intelligence and position of trust to commit unspeakable acts, and handed down 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. When the news reached me in Connecticut, I allowed myself one night of collapse, one night of screaming into pillows, of rage sobbing in the shower while Cassidy slept peacefully in her crib. Then I locked it all away, sealed it in the same mental compartment where I kept the real Daniel Blackwood. The library became my sanctuary and salvation. I threw myself into children's programming, story hours, and community outreach. The simple joy of introducing young minds to literature provided a counterbalance to the darkness I carried inside. The rhythm of our days, morning routine, work, Playtime with Cassidy, dinner, bedtime stories, created a structure I could hold on to. Cassidy grew from a wobbly toddler into a curious preschooler with an innate kindness that reassured me daily she had inherited nothing of her father's nature. She had his eyes, yes, that brilliant blue that sometimes startled me in certain lights, but behind them was only warmth, empathy, and normal childhood mischief. Our small family expanded to include chosen members. Rebecca visited from Seattle whenever she could, becoming Auntie Becca to Cassidy. My parents drove down from Massachusetts monthly, and slowly, carefully, I allowed new friendships to form in Brookfield. Sarah Parker, another single mother at the library, became my closest local friend. Her daughter Maya was just 3 months younger than Cassidy, and the girls became inseparable. When Sarah asked about Thomas, I delivered my practice story with just enough emotional restraint to discourage further questions. "It must have been so hard," she said, "moving across country with a baby, starting over after losing him." "We survived," I said simply. "That's what mothers do." As Cassidy approached school age, her questions about her father began, innocent at first. "Did my daddy like dinosaurs too?" she asked at 4, clutching a plastic triceratops. "He loved them," I said, the lie coming easily. "He had models of them in his office." At 5, "Maya's daddy takes her fishing." "My daddy would have taken me fishing if he was here, right? Every weekend," I promised, tucking her in. "He was so excited to teach you things." With each fabrication, I added layers to Thomas Mitchell, building a ghost that Cassidy could love without fear, shaping a legacy she could carry with pride rather than shame. I kept a journal of my lies to ensure consistency, reviewing it regularly like studying for an ongoing exam where failure meant devastating my daughter's sense of self. On Cassidy's first day of kindergarten, standing in our kitchen in her carefully chosen outfit, she asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do I look like my daddy?" I knelt before her, straightening the little collar of her dress. Her blue eyes, Daniel's eyes, searched mine with innocent curiosity. "You have his eyes," I admitted, because that much was impossible to deny. "And his smile. He was very handsome, and you're very beautiful." She beamed, pleased with this connection to the father she'd never known. "But you know what you got from me?" I continued, tapping her chest gently. "Your heart. Your kind heart that cares about everyone and everything." It wasn't entirely a lie. Daniel Blackwood had no heart, at least not one capable of human empathy or love. Whatever goodness existed in Cassidy came either from me or was uniquely her own, a miracle that defied genetics. As she grew older, I watched vigilantly for any sign of disturbance, any dark tendency that might suggest Daniel's influence. There were none. Cassidy was bright, sensitive, occasionally strong-willed, but never cruel. She rescued injured birds, stood up to playground bullies, shared her lunch with classmates who forgot theirs. By 3rd grade, she was known for organizing her friends to pick up litter in the schoolyard and starting a campaign to have the cafeteria compost food waste. "Your daughter is so community-minded," her teachers told me at conferences. "Such natural leadership abilities, but always thinking of others." I would nod and smile, relief washing through me. Each year of normal childhood development, each act of spontaneous kindness, each healthy friendship she formed was evidence contradicting Daniel's poisonous prediction about his legacy. For her 10th birthday, Cassidy asked for a special gift, a memory book about Thomas. "I want to know everything about him," she said. "All your memories." I spent weeks creating it, selecting photos of Thomas at various ages, writing fictional anecdotes about our courtship and marriage, inventing tender moments between father and unborn daughter. I included ticket stubs from concerts we'd supposedly attended, pressed flowers from imaginary anniversaries, sketches of buildings he'd allegedly designed. When I presented it to her, Cassidy spent hours poring over each page, asking questions I answered with rehearsed nostalgia. "He would have been so proud of you," I told her as she traced his stranger's face with her finger. "So proud of the person you're becoming." "I wish I could have known him," she said, eyes filling with tears. I held her close, my own eyes dry. I'd used up my tears for Daniel Blackwood years ago. "He knew you," I whispered. "For a few months before he died, he knew you. And he loved you more than anything in the world." This part I allowed myself to believe. In those early months after Cassidy's birth, before the arrests and revelations, there had been moments when Daniel held her with what seemed like genuine tenderness. Perhaps even monsters are capable of some form of love, however twisted. Or perhaps it had all been part of his performance. I would never know. What I did know was that the fiction I'd created served Cassidy better than the truth. Thomas Mitchell gave her roots, heritage, a sense of being wanted and loved from the beginning. Daniel Blackwood would have given her only shame, doubt, and a lifetime of being watched for signs of inherited evil. As she entered her teenage years, Cassidy developed a passion for social justice that both moved and terrified me. She volunteered at homeless shelters, organized fundraisers for domestic violence victims, and became involved in prison reform advocacy. The irony was almost unbearable. The system just warehouses people, she argued at dinner one night, 16 and fierce in her convictions. Even violent offenders need rehabilitation, not just punishment. Everyone deserves a chance to heal and change. I nodded, unable to tell her that her biological father was beyond rehabilitation, beyond change, that some people chose evil so completely it became their nature. I'm thinking of studying criminal psychology, she announced in her junior year of high school, to understand why people commit violent acts and how we can prevent them. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, helping me clean up the mess. "Fine," I managed, just surprised. "That's a intense field." "I know," she said, eyes alight with purpose, the same intense focus I'd once admired in Daniel. "But imagine if I could help identify warning signs early, before someone hurts others. I could make a real difference." The cruel symmetry threatened to choke me. Daniel had studied the psychology of violence too, not to prevent it, but to perfect it. Now his daughter, unknowing, was drawn to the same subject from the opposite moral direction. When Harvard accepted her with a partial scholarship, I was both proud and terrified. Boston was only 2 hours from our home, but it felt like I was sending her out into a world where the truth might find her. The internet had grown exponentially since our reinvention. Old news stories about the psychology professor killer remained in digital archives. Daniel's case appeared in criminology textbooks she might soon be reading. The night before she left for college, Cassidy brought out the memory book of Thomas, now worn from years of handling. "I'm taking this with me," she said, sitting beside me on the couch, "so Dad can watch over me at school." I nodded, unable to speak. "Mom," she said, suddenly serious, "you never really talk about how it felt. Losing him, raising me alone. It must have been so hard." I looked at my beautiful daughter. Kind, brilliant, compassionate. The best thing that had ever happened to me and the only good thing to come from my relationship with Daniel. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," I said truthfully, "but also the most important. Everything I did was to give you a good life, a normal life. You succeeded," she said, hugging me tightly. "Thanks to you, I never felt like something was missing. You made sure Dad was always part of our family, even if he couldn't be here physically." I held her, feeling the weight of 2 decades of deception, wondering if I'd done right or wrong by creating Thomas Mitchell, wondering if the growing dread I felt was intuition or paranoia. The truth had stayed buried for 23 years, but as Cassidy prepared to study the very field that had been both her father's expertise and his cover, I sensed the earth shifting above that grave. Some secrets refused to stay buried forever. The summons came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in September, 6 weeks after I'd helped Cassidy settle into her dorm at Harvard. The official envelope bore the seal of the Colorado Department of Corrections, and my hands trembled as I sliced it open at my kitchen table. Inmate Daniel Blackwood has requested a supervised visitation with his daughter, Cassidy Blackwood, now Mitchell. The letter stated in cold, bureaucratic language. As Ms. Mitchell has now reached the age of majority, the department is required to inform her of this request. I read the letter 3 times, my heart hammering against my ribs. For 23 years, Daniel had made no attempt to contact either of us. His silence had been our protection, allowing the fiction of Thomas Mitchell to stand unchallenged. Why now? What did he want from our daughter? The letter continued. While we cannot compel Ms. Mitchell to respond, we are legally obligated to forward this request. Enclosed, please find inmate Blackwood's personal communication to his daughter, which has been reviewed for appropriate content. A second sealed envelope was clipped to the letter. My name was not on it. It was addressed simply to my daughter. I set it aside, unable to bring myself to open it. This was Cassidy's letter, but she didn't even know the man who'd written it existed. Opening it meant acknowledging the lie I'd constructed, the 23 years of elaborate deception. I called my lawyer instead, the same woman who had handled our name change and relocation decades ago. "Legally, you have no obligation to forward this to Cassidy," she advised after I explained the situation. "He has no parental rights. Those were terminated during sentencing. But now that she's an adult," I began. "Now that she's an adult, it's technically her choice whether to have contact with him," she admitted. "But she can't make that choice if she doesn't know he exists. So I can just ignore this?" There was a heavy pause on the line. "You can. But Ellie, she's studying criminal psychology. At some point, his case might come up. These things have a way of revealing themselves." After hanging up, I sat with the sealed letter for hours, turning it over in my hands, feeling the weight of Daniel's words inside. What poison had he written to our daughter? What manipulations? What lies? Or worse, what truths? I finally decided to burn it, just as I'd burned his jail letter 23 years ago, to protect Cassidy, as I always had. I held it over the kitchen sink, lighter in hand, when my phone buzzed with a text. "Mom, weird question.
Do you know a Daniel Blackwood? Professor in my criminology class mentioned him as a case study, and I had the strangest feeling. Probably nothing. Just curious if the name rings a bell." The letter and lighter clattered into the sink. I gripped the counter to stay upright, blood rushing in my ears. Too late. I was too late. I drove to Harvard that afternoon, the unopened letter on my passenger seat like a bomb about to detonate.
Cassidy met me at a coffee shop near campus, concerned by my insistence on seeing her in person. "Mom, what's wrong? You look terrible," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. Her face was so open, so trusting. I was about to destroy that trust forever. "We need to talk about something," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "About your father." Her forehead creased with confusion. "About Dad? What about him?" "Not Thomas," I said, the words scraping my throat. "Your biological father." She stared at me, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" I placed the Colorado Department of Corrections letter on the table between us. "This came today. It's from Daniel Blackwood. The man my criminology professor mentioned today he's your biological father, Cassidy." Her face drained of color. "That's not funny, Mom. I wish I was joking," I whispered. "I've been protecting you from this truth your entire life." Her hands began to shake. "The psychology professor killer? The man who murdered those students? That's who you're talking about?" I nodded, unable to speak. "That's impossible," she said, voice rising enough that nearby patrons glanced our way. "Thomas Mitchell was my father. You have pictures, letters, memories. All fabricated," I admitted. "I created Thomas to give you a normal life, away from the shadow of what Daniel did." Cassidy stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her untouched coffee. "You've been lying to me for 23 years? Every story about my father, every memory, every detail of who I am and where I came from, all lies? I was trying to protect you," I pleaded. "Protect me? By building my entire identity on a foundation of fiction?" Her voice cracked. "Do you have any idea what this means? Everything I thought I knew about myself is wrong." Students at nearby tables were openly staring now. Cassidy grabbed her backpack and headed for the door. I followed her outside into the crisp autumn air. "Cassidy, please, did you ever plan to tell me?" she demanded, whirling to face me on the sidewalk. "Or would you have let me live my entire life believing a lie?" The truth was damning, but I owed her that much at least. "I hoped you'd never have to know." She laughed bitterly. "Well, that plan failed spectacularly. My criminology professor put Daniel Blackwood's case on our syllabus. We're studying him next week. Can you imagine if I'd walked into class unprepared for that? I couldn't. The scenario was too horrific to contemplate. Cassidy sitting in a lecture hall while her professor dissected the psychopathology of her biological father, perhaps even showing crime scene photos, all while she had no idea of her connection to the monster being analyzed. "I'm sorry," I said, knowing the words were wholly inadequate. I thought I was doing what was best for you. Best for me? She repeated incredulously. Or best for you, Mom? Was it easier to pretend he didn't exist than to deal with the fact that you married a serial killer? The accusation struck like a physical blow. That's not fair. None of this is fair, she shouted. Not what he did, not what you did, not what I'm learning right now on a random street corner. I handed her the sealed letter that had been burning a hole in my bag. He sent this for you. I didn't open it. She stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. I don't want anything from him. You don't have to read it. You don't have to acknowledge him at all. He has no legal rights to you. Rights, she echoed hollowly. He's my father. He's half my DNA. All this time I've been studying criminal psychology, drawn to understanding the minds of violent offenders. And it turns out I'm the daughter of one of the most infamous cases in modern history. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Is that why I'm fascinated by criminal minds? Is it in my blood? No, I said fiercely. You are nothing like him. Your interest comes from your compassion, your desire to help and heal. His actions came from a place of emptiness and cruelty. How would you know? You married him. You lived with him. You didn't see what he really was either. Another blow, but I couldn't argue. She was right. I need time, Cassidy said, backing away from me. I can't process this right now. Please, I begged. Come home with me. Let me explain everything properly. Explain what? 23 years of lies? The fact that the memory book I cherished was a complete fabrication? That my father isn't a heroic architect who died tragically, but a psychopath locked in a supermax prison? She shook her head. I need to be alone. I watched her walk away, her shoulders rigid with shock and betrayal. The daughter I'd raised, protected, and lied to for her entire life was now carrying the very burden I'd tried to spare her, the knowledge of her true paternity and all its terrible implications. Back in my car, I sobbed until I could hardly breathe, gripping the steering wheel as my carefully constructed world collapsed around me. Everything I'd done, every lie, every fabrication, every omission, had been to protect Cassidy from exactly this moment of devastating revelation. Yet in trying to shield her from Daniel's legacy, I'd created a different kind of damage. I'd robbed her of agency, of truth, of the chance to confront her origins on her own terms. I drove back to Connecticut in a daze, pulled into our driveway, and sat staring at the house where we'd built our life on elaborately constructed falsehoods. The porch where I'd told Cassidy stories about Thomas teaching her to ride a bike. The garden where I'd said he'd planned to build her a treehouse. The attic where I'd hidden the metal box containing the evidence of my deception. Newspaper clippings, court documents, the single photograph I couldn't bring myself to destroy. The photograph she'd found this morning, setting this day of reckoning in motion. Inside the house, I moved like a ghost, through rooms haunted by my own lies. I picked up the framed photo of Thomas, actually a stranger whose picture I'd found at an estate sale, and hurled it against the wall, watching the glass shatter. My phone rang repeatedly. Rebecca, my parents, even Sarah, all alerted by Cassidy that something was terribly wrong. I ignored them all. There was nothing anyone could say to fix what I'd broken. Late that night, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Professor Lawrence from Harvard's Criminal Psychology Department. I'm concerned about Cassidy. She came to my office this afternoon in extreme distress, revealing her relationship to Daniel Blackwood. She's asked to withdraw from my course, but I'm worried about her mental state. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. I called immediately. Ms. Mitchell, thank you for returning my call, the professor said. I want you to know that I've arranged for Cassidy to speak with the university's psychological services. She was quite distraught. Where is she now? I asked, already grabbing my car keys. She's staying with her roommate tonight. She asked for privacy, but I felt obligated to reach out to you given the circumstances. Professor, I said, my voice breaking. Did she read the letter? From Daniel? There was a pause on the line. Yes, she did. In my office. She wanted someone knowledgeable about his case to be present. What did it say? I whispered. I don't feel it's my place to share that, he said carefully. But I will tell you that it was manipulative, designed to create a connection. These types of offenders are expert manipulators, Ms. Mitchell. I warned Cassidy about this. Thank you, I managed. There's something else, he added. Cassidy mentioned planning to visit him. My blood ran cold. What? She was very upset, possibly not thinking clearly. I strongly advised against it, of course, but she seemed determined, said she needed to see him face to face, to understand. After ending the call, I tried Cassidy's phone repeatedly, each call going straight to voicemail. I left message after desperate message, begging her not to contact Daniel, not to let him manipulate her, not to give him what he wanted, access to the daughter he'd once chillingly called his legacy. I drove to Harvard again the next morning, only to find that Cassidy had already left campus. Her roommate, wide-eyed and clearly shaken by whatever had transpired, told me Cassidy had packed a bag and said she needed a few days to figure things out. She was really messed up, the girl added, kept looking at this old photograph and saying everything was a lie. Back home, I waited in agony, checking flight schedules to Colorado, calling the prison to see if Cassidy had scheduled a visit, reaching out to everyone who might know where she'd gone. 3 days of silence stretched my nerves to breaking point, then the phone call that shattered what remained of my heart. Ms. Mitchell, this is Warden Michaels from Centennial Correctional Facility in Colorado. Your daughter Cassidy visited inmate Blackwood this morning. The room tilted around me. Too late. I was too late. I'm calling because the visit ended problematically, the warden continued. There was an incident. Is she hurt? I gasped. Not physically, no, but she became extremely distressed during the visit. Inmate Blackwood apparently shared some disturbing information with her that caused a severe emotional reaction. Our staff had to remove her from the visitation area. Where is she now? I demanded. She left the facility about an hour ago. She was very upset, Ms. Mitchell. Our staff offered psychological support, but she refused. Given her state, I felt obligated to notify her next of kin. I booked the next flight to Colorado, packed nothing, and drove straight to the airport. During the endless flight, I imagined what poisonous words Daniel had poured into our daughter's ear, what manipulations he had deployed, what damage he had done in one brief visitation that I could never undo. Had he told her she was like him, that she carried his darkness, that I had kept them apart because I feared what she might become? Landing in Denver, I rented a car and drove frantically toward the small motel near the prison where the warden had said Cassidy had been staying. Halfway there, my phone rang. Cassidy's number at last. Where are you? I answered, pulling to the shoulder of the highway. At the airport, she said, her voice hollow. Coming home. Cassidy, I'm in Colorado. I came to find you. A bitter laugh. Of course you did. Still trying to control the situation. I'm trying to help you, I said, to protect you from him. It's too late for that, Mom, she said, and something in her tone froze my blood. I've met my father now, the real one, not your invention, and he told me things about you that you've never had the courage to tell me yourself. Whatever he said you knew, she cut in, voice shaking with emotion. He said you suspected what he was doing but looked the other way because you loved the prestige of being a professor's wife. He said you found evidence once and he convinced you it was for research. He said you were complicit. He's lying, I cried, gripping the phone so hard my fingers went numb. That's what he does, Cassidy. He manipulates people. He twists the truth. Then why did you run? She demanded. Why change our names, hide across the country, build this elaborate fiction? Was it really to protect me, or to protect yourself from being known as the woman who was too blind or too weak to see what was happening right in front of her? Each word was a knife, sliding between my ribs with terrible precision. I never knew, I whispered. I swear on my life, on everything I love, on you, Cassidy. I never knew what he was until the police came, and everything I did afterward was to give you a chance at a normal life. A normal life built on lies, she said flatly. My flight's boarding. I'll be back in Boston tonight. Please let me come to you. Let's talk face to face. No, she said with finality. I need space. I need to process what I've learned. About him, about you, about myself. Don't come to campus. Don't call. I'll contact you when I'm ready. The line went dead, leaving me stranded on a Colorado highway, 1,000 miles from home, and immeasurably far from the daughter whose trust I had irrevocably broken. In that moment, I felt the full weight of both Daniel's betrayal and my own. He had used me as his cover, his perfect normal wife, to hide his monstrous nature, and then I had constructed an equally elaborate deception, hiding his existence from our daughter. 2 different lies, with the same destructive power. Driving back to the Denver airport in defeat, I wondered if there had ever been another path, if telling Cassidy the truth from the beginning would have been better than the protection I thought I was providing, if letting her grow up knowing her father was a murderer would have been less damaging than letting her discover it now, as a young woman whose very sense of self had been built on my careful fabrications. I had sacrificed truth for protection. Daniel had sacrificed lives for his perverse desires. In Cassidy's eyes, perhaps we were both unforgivable. The flight home was a blur of grief and fear. What if she never spoke to me again? What if Daniel had planted seeds of doubt about her own nature that would grow into self-destruction? What if, in trying to shield her from his darkness, I had pushed her directly into its path? Back in our empty house, the house of Thomas Mitchell's ghost, I finally read the articles Cassidy had found in the metal box that morning. The headlines screamed accusations that, in retrospect, seemed obvious. Professor's wife, oblivious or accomplice. The perfect cover, how Eleanor Blackwood never suspected. Red flags ignored, the woman who slept beside a killer. The world had questioned 23 years ago what Cassidy was questioning now. How could I not have known? In the silence of our home, surrounded by the scaffolding of my elaborate lies, I confronted the hardest truth of all, that in my desperate attempt to protect my daughter from her father's legacy, I might have lost her forever. A week of silence followed. 7 days of unanswered calls and texts, of driving past Cassidy's dorm hoping for a glimpse of her, of sleepless nights staring at the ceiling wondering if she was okay. 7 days of feeling the foundations of my life crumbling beneath me. On the 8th day, I returned from work to find Sarah sitting on my porch steps. In the 20 years of our friendship, I had never told her the truth about Thomas Mitchell or Daniel Blackwood. Now her eyes held a knowledge that told me that had changed. "Cassidy called me," she said simply as I approached. She needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't you. I sank onto the step beside her, too exhausted for pretense. "And now you know." "Now I know," she confirmed, "that Thomas never existed, that you've been running from Daniel Blackwood for 23 years, that everything I thought I knew about my best friend was carefully edited." "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it. I couldn't risk telling anyone. The more people who knew, the greater the chance Cassidy would find out. Sarah was silent for a long moment, the October wind rustling the leaves around us. "I understand why you did it," she said finally. "I'm not sure I would have had the strength to do what you did, to reinvent yourself so completely, to carry that burden alone." I looked at her, surprised by the absence of judgment in her voice. "Don't misunderstand me," she continued. "I'm hurt that you didn't trust me, but I'm also in awe of your dedication to protecting your daughter. That kind of fierce love. It's rare, Ellie. And now I've lost her," I whispered. "Everything I did to protect her has pushed her away." Sarah shook her head. "You haven't lost her. She's angry, confused, hurt, but she loves you. That doesn't disappear overnight. Did she tell you what he said to her? At the prison?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Some of it. Enough to know he's a manipulative monster who tried to drive a wedge between you, tried to make her believe you knew about his crimes, that you were somehow complicit." "I wasn't," I said desperately. "You have to believe me." "I do," Sarah said firmly. "And deep down, so does Cassidy. But right now she's questioning everything she thought she knew. About you, about herself. She needs time." "What do I do?" I asked, feeling more lost than I had since those first terrible days after Daniel's arrest. "You wait," Sarah said, "and you prepare to tell her the whole truth when she's ready to hear it. Not the sanitized version you've been protecting her from, but all of it. The real story of how you survived, how you rebuilt your lives. She deserves that now." Later that night, alone in my kitchen, I opened the fireproof safe where I kept the last remnants of our former life. The few pieces of evidence I hadn't been able to bring myself to destroy. The marriage certificate with both our original names. Cassidy's birth certificate listing Daniel as her father. Newspaper clippings I'd saved to remind myself that the nightmare had been real. And the photograph Cassidy had found. The only one I'd kept of Daniel and me together. Taken on a Seattle beach early in our relationship. I spread these artifacts of my former life across the kitchen table, and for the first time in decades, allowed myself to look directly at them. To remember not just the horror of discovery, but the woman I had been before, trusting, naive, blindly in love with a man who had selected me specifically for those qualities. The face looking back from that beach photograph wasn't me anymore. That Eleanor had died the day the police came. In her place stood a woman who had reinvented herself entirely, who had constructed an impenetrable fortress around her daughter, who had become as skilled at maintaining appearances as Daniel had been. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my determination to protect Cassidy from her father's legacy of deception, I had become a master of deception myself. A text message broke my reverie. "I'm coming home this weekend. We need to talk. See." 2 days later, I heard Cassidy's key in the lock. She entered our home like a visitor, hesitant and watchful. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her typically neat appearance disheveled. She carried a backpack and the memory book of Thomas Mitchell, which she placed on the coffee table between us as she sat. "I want the truth," she said without preamble. "All of it. No more protecting me, no more editing. Everything." I nodded, throat tight. "Where do you want me to start?" "The beginning. How you met him, what he was really like, when you realized who he was." So I told her. All of it. The young librarian dazzled by the charismatic professor. The whirlwind romance that swept away all warnings. The gradual isolation that I'd mistaken for intimacy. The strange behaviors I'd rationalized. The growing unease I'd suppressed. The devastating shock of discovery. I told her about the evidence they'd found. The horrific details I'd shielded her from all these years. About Daniel's journals and his chilling references to her as his legacy. About the media circus that had painted me as either complicit or impossibly stupid. About my decision to erase him from our lives and create Thomas Mitchell instead. "I wanted you to have a father you could be proud of," I explained, watching her face for reactions. "Not one who would define your life with his crimes. But he is my father," Cassidy said quietly. "His DNA is half of who I am. Did you ever worry that I could be like him?" The question I dreaded most. "At first," I admitted. "When you were a baby, I watched for signs. But Cassidy, from your first smile, your first acts of spontaneous kindness, I knew. You had nothing of his nature in you. Nothing. He told me that criminal tendencies can skip generations," she said, eyes downcast. "That his grandmother was suspected of poisoning 3 husbands. He said it was in our bloodline. That someday I might feel the same urges he did. That's a lie," I said firmly. "A cruel manipulation designed to hurt you, to make you doubt yourself. Psychology doesn't work that way. Even identical twins raised apart don't necessarily share criminal tendencies. You are your own person, Cassidy. You always have been." She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "Then why am I drawn to understanding criminal minds? Why have I always been fascinated by what makes people do terrible things? What if that's his influence?" I moved to sit beside her, not touching her but close enough to share the same air. "You're drawn to understanding because you have empathy, because you want to prevent harm, because you believe in rehabilitation and second chances. Those are my values, not his. Daniel studied violence as a blueprint. You study it as a healer." She was silent for a long time, absorbing this. Finally, she reached for the memory book on the table. "None of this was real," she said, rifling through pages of fabricated memories. "Thomas Mitchell never existed. The love in those stories was real," I said softly. "Everything I wrote about how a father should love his daughter, that was real. I just gave that love a different name, a different face. I can never look at these pictures the same way again," she said, closing the book. "Every time I see them now, I'll know they're strangers, that the stories are fiction." "I know," I acknowledged, "and I'm sorry for that loss. I thought I was giving you a gift, a father to be proud of, a history without shame. I didn't consider what would happen when you inevitably learned the truth. Did you ever plan to tell me?" I couldn't lie. "Not anymore." "No," I admitted. "I hoped you'd never have to know." She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "That's what I thought." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where she'd grown up. "I've withdrawn from my criminology class. I can't study him like a case study. Not now." "I understand," I said, though my heart ached for her interrupted plans. "I've been seeing a therapist at school," she continued, "trying to process all this. She says I need to find a way to integrate this new knowledge into my sense of self, that I can't just reject it or pretend it isn't true." "That sounds wise," I said carefully. Cassidy turned back to me, her expression resolute. I'm not going to contact him again. The visit he wasn't interested in me as a person, only as an extension of himself, a validation of his ego. Even after 23 years in prison, he feels no remorse, no responsibility. He's exactly what you tried to protect me from. Relief washed through me. So powerful I felt lightheaded. Cassidy? But, she cut in, that doesn't mean I can just go back to before. I need to find my own way forward now. With the truth, not comforting lies. What does that mean? I asked, fear creeping back. It means I need space. Time. I'm going to stay with Maya in Boston for a while. I need to figure out who I am now, knowing what I know. You're still the same person you've always been, I insisted. Knowing about Daniel doesn't change who you are, but it changes how I understand myself, she countered. And it changes how I see you. You're not just my self-sacrificing single mom anymore. You're a woman who survived a relationship with a serial killer, who rebuilt her entire life from scratch, who carried an impossible secret for decades. She paused. I need to get to know that woman, the real you, not just the mother you let me see. I nodded, understanding. For 23 years, I had carefully curated not just the fiction of Thomas Mitchell, but my own presentation as Cassidy's mother. I had buried the frightened, traumatized woman who fled Seattle. I had hidden my nightmares, my hypervigilance, my constant fear of discovery. Will you come back? I asked, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. Of course, she said, softening slightly. This is still my home. You're still my mother. I just need time to reconcile the story I thought was true with the reality. Before she left, she hugged me, briefly, stiffly, but it was something. A bridge not completely burned. In the days that followed her departure, I moved through our house as if seeing it for the first time. The careful shrine to a fictional father, the precisely maintained narrative of our past, the fortress of protection I'd built that had become, in its own way, a prison. For 23 years, I had been stuck in the amber of that terrible time, perpetually the traumatized young mother fleeing a nightmare, forever the keeper of a secret that could destroy my daughter's sense of self. I had protected Cassidy, yes, but I had also kept myself from ever fully healing, from ever moving forward from the shadow of Daniel Blackwood. In protecting Cassidy, I had remained trapped in the past. In sheltering her from Daniel's darkness, I had kept myself tethered to it. As October turned to November, I began, slowly, to dismantle the elaborate architecture of our lie. I removed the photographs of Thomas from the walls, packing them carefully in a box for Cassidy to decide what to do with later. I gathered the fabricated mementos, the forged love letters, the constructed evidence of a life that never was. In their place, I hung photographs of Cassidy and me together, real moments from our real life. Her kindergarten graduation, her winning science fair project, our hiking trip to Vermont. The two of us, mother and daughter, without the ghost of either Thomas Mitchell or Daniel Blackwood standing between us. I called my parents and finally told them everything I'd kept from them about the extent of my deception. I invited Rebecca for a weekend visit and opened up about the toll of maintaining the lie for so long. I even told Sarah the full truth of how I'd constructed Thomas Mitchell from scraps of strangers' lives. My God, Ellie, she said as we sat in my newly rearranged living room. You could have been a novelist with that imagination. Or a criminal, I said ruefully. Sometimes I wonder if Daniel saw that in me, the capacity for elaborate deception, if that's why he chose me. No, Sarah said firmly. He chose you because you were kind and trusting. You became a master of deception out of necessity, out of protection. That's entirely different. For the first time in 23 years, I began to consider a life not defined by secrets and fear, a life where I was neither Daniel's victim nor Cassidy's protective shield, but simply Eleanor Mitchell, a woman with her own identity, her own future. Cassidy called weekly, our conversations gradually warming from awkward formality to something approaching our former closeness. She told me about her sessions with her therapist, about her decision to switch her major from psychology to law, about her growing interest in advocating for children of incarcerated parents. There are support groups, she told me during one call, for people like me, whose parents committed violent crimes, people who carry that legacy. It helps to know I'm not alone. Are you telling people? I asked hesitantly. About Daniel? Some people, she said. My closest friends. My therapist thinks selective disclosure is healthier than total secrecy. That shame grows in silence. She was right, of course. My decades of silence had been as much about my shame as about her protection. Just before Thanksgiving, Cassidy called with news that sent my heart racing. "I've been invited to speak at a criminology symposium," she said, "about the impact of violent crime on perpetrators' families. They want me to talk about my experiences as Daniel Blackwood's daughter. Are you going to do it?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice neutral. "I think so," she said, "not to sensationalize it or to claim some kind of victimhood, but to put a human face to the collateral damage of violent crime, to help people understand that the ripples of violence affect generations." I closed my eyes, imagining my daughter standing at a podium, publicly claiming the identity I had spent her lifetime helping her escape. "Are you sure you're ready for that? Once it's public, you can't take it back." "I know," she said, "but Mom, I'm tired of hiding, of worrying who might discover the truth. I want to control my own narrative, not live in fear of it being exposed." After we hung up, I sat in my garden watching dead leaves swirl in the November wind. My daughter was choosing to step into the light with a truth I had kept buried in darkness. She was braver than I had ever been. That night, I dreamt not of Daniel or the horrors of discovery, but of Cassidy standing tall and unashamed, speaking her truth to a rapt audience. In the dream, I stood in the back of the auditorium, not hiding but supporting, not controlling, but witnessing her claim her full identity. Daniel Blackwood's biological daughter, yes, but more importantly, her own woman making her own way in the world. I woke with tears on my face but a curious lightness in my chest. For the first time in 23 years, I could glimpse a future where the shadow of Daniel Blackwood did not define either of us. A future where the truth, however painful, had set us both free. December arrived with bitter cold and the first snowfall of the season. I watched from my kitchen window as white flakes erased the contours of my garden, covering the dead remnants of summer with a clean, blank canvas. There was something fitting about the transformation, the way nature periodically wipes the slate clean, allowing for new beginnings. My phone rang, Cassidy's ringtone. "I found something," she said without greeting. "In the Harvard archives." My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean?" "I've been researching Daniel's academic history," she explained. "Following his career backward, Harvard has digital archives of psychological journals going back decades. He published here before moving to Washington." The familiar dread pooled in my stomach. "Cassidy, why are you doing this?" "Because I need to understand," she said firmly. "Not just who he was to you, but who he was professionally. How someone respected in his field could hide such darkness." I couldn't argue with her need to make sense of the senseless. Wasn't that what I had tried to do for 23 years? "What did you find?" I asked, steeling myself. "A paper he published in 1997, 2 years before he met you. It was on the intergenerational transmission of violent tendencies." She paused. "Mom, it's eerie. It's like a blueprint for what he later did." "What do you mean?" "He was studying whether violent criminals pass their tendencies genetically to their children. The paper concludes that while there's no definitive violence gene, certain psychological traits might be hereditary. It's like he was researching himself, his own nature. And potentially, mine." I sank into a kitchen chair, memories resurfacing. Daniel, watching baby Cassidy with clinical interest. His comments about her having his eyes, his blood, his reference to her as his legacy in those terrible journals. "There's more," Cassidy continued. "I found correspondence between Daniel and his doctoral advisor, letters questioning the ethical boundaries of his research, warnings about his unhealthy fixation on predatory psychology. Red flags," I murmured. "More red flags that everyone missed." "Not everyone," she corrected. "His advisor saw something concerning. The University Ethics Board questioned some of his research methods, but Daniel was brilliant at deflection, at making his critics seem paranoid or prudish." Sound familiar? It did. Daniel had done the same with me whenever I questioned his late nights or strange behaviors, making me feel irrational, overly suspicious, insufficiently supportive of his important work. "Mom," Cassidy said, her voice dropping, "I think he was planning it all along. His academic focus wasn't just cover for his crimes. I think he was genuinely studying predatory behavior because he recognized it in himself and wanted to perfect it. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the December snow. Daniel using his academic position not just to access victims, but to study and refine his own pathology. It made a terrible kind of sense. "There's something else," Cassidy continued, hesitation in her voice. "Something about you." My pulse quickened. About me? In one of his papers, he discusses protective factors, elements that might prevent violence in someone with predisposition toward it. He specifically mentions stable attachment to a highly empathic caregiver as a primary protective factor. She paused. "Mom, I think he chose you deliberately, not just as cover, but as what he considered optimal maternal material." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "Are you saying he selected me to be your mother because he thought my empathy would counterbalance whatever darkness he thought he was passing to you?" "It's a theory," she said carefully, "but it fits with what we know about how calculated he was, how methodical." I felt suddenly dizzy, the kitchen spinning around me. Had my entire relationship with Daniel been even more of a manipulation than I'd realized? Had he selected me not just as the perfect naive wife to provide cover for his crimes, but as the perfect empathic mother for his biological experiment? "I need to see these papers," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I've already emailed you the PDFs," Cassidy replied. "But Mom, there's more. I've requested access to his personal papers from the university archives. His research notes, drafts, correspondence, all the material that wasn't part of the public record. The archivist said they've been sealed since his arrest, but I might be granted access as a family member conducting academic research. Are you sure you want to go deeper into this?" I asked. "It sounds consuming. I need to know," she said simply. "And I think you do too. We've spent 23 years running from the truth. Maybe it's time we turned and faced it." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and found Cassidy's email. 3 PDFs of Daniel's academic publications, clinical and detached in their language, but chilling in their implications. I recognized his writing style instantly, the precise vocabulary, the elegant structure, the authoritative tone that had once impressed me as the mark of a brilliant mind. Now I could see the cold calculation beneath the academic veneer. Daniel hadn't just been studying predatory behavior. He had been documenting his own methodology, hiding his confessions in plain sight within peer-reviewed journals. Most disturbing was the paper Cassidy had mentioned, Protective Factors Against Violence Transmission, the Empathy Hypothesis. In it, Daniel meticulously documented how children with genetic predispositions toward violence might be redirected through careful environmental engineering, particularly through bonding with a highly empathic primary caregiver. The paper included a profile of the ideal maternal figure for such intervention, a woman with high empathy scores, nurturing tendencies, strong ethical frameworks, and natural intuition about others' emotional states. He had been describing me, selecting me, years before we ever met. I closed the laptop, bile rising in my throat. Our entire relationship, our marriage, our home, our child, had been part of Daniel's twisted experiment. He had chosen me not for love, but for my psychological profile. He had created Cassidy not from desire for family, but as a test of his theories about genetic inheritance. The violation was so profound, so complete, that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then rage, pure, clarifying rage, washed through me. Not the helpless anger I'd felt after his arrest, but something stronger, more focused. A fury that burned away the last vestiges of the naive young librarian who had loved Daniel Blackwood. I reopened the laptop and read every word of his papers, no longer flinching from their implications. I took notes, following his twisted logic to its conclusions, seeing for the first time the full scope of his manipulation, and perhaps, inadvertently, his greatest miscalculation. Because if Daniel had selected me for my empathy, my protective instincts, my ethical strength, then he had chosen the very qualities that would ensure his legacy would never fulfill his dark expectations. In trying to engineer the perfect environment to test his theories, he had created the perfect environment to disprove them. The irony was both terrible and vindicating. 3 days later, Cassidy called again, her voice tight with excitement and trepidation. "They're giving me access to his papers. I'm driving to the Special Collections Library tomorrow. I'm coming with you," I said immediately. A pause. "Are you sure? It might be difficult, I'm sure, I said. I've spent 23 years hiding from Daniel Blackwood. It's time I faced what he really was, what he tried to make of us. The next morning, I drove to Cambridge and met Cassidy outside the imposing brick building housing Harvard's special collections. She looked different somehow, more centered, more purposeful than when I'd last seen her. The lost, betrayed girl who had fled our house a month earlier had been replaced by a young woman on a mission. "Thank you for coming," she said as we walked up the stone steps together. I wasn't sure I wanted to do this alone. The archivist met us in a private reading room, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor who gave no indication she recognized the significance of the material she was providing. "These are the Blackwood papers," she explained, placing 3 acid-free boxes on the table. "They've been sealed since 2002 at the request of the FBI. Your academic credentials and family connection have granted you special access, Ms. Mitchell." Cassidy nodded, her face composed. "Thank you. My mother and I are conducting research on the intersection of academic work and criminal psychology." A convenient half-truth that the archivist accepted without question. She explained the handling procedures for archival materials and left us alone with the boxes. Alone with Daniel's private thoughts. Cassidy looked at me. "Ready?" I nodded, unable to speak. We opened the first box together, revealing folders of neatly organized research notes, draft papers, and correspondence. Daniel's handwriting, precise, slanted, controlled, leapt out at me from the yellowing pages, so familiar it made my stomach clench. For hours we worked in silence, each taking a different box, occasionally passing a document to the other when we found something significant. The picture that emerged was more disturbing than either of us had imagined. Daniel had been conducting his own private research study for years, long before meeting me, before his crimes in Seattle. He had been methodically documenting his theories about genetic predisposition to violence, using himself as the primary subject. In a journal labeled simply Self-Observations, he wrote clinically about his own violent urges, his lack of empathy, his growing fascination with causing pain. He documented his techniques for mimicking normal human emotion, for creating the appearance of connection while feeling none. He analyzed his own psychology with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "Listen to this," Cassidy said, breaking our long silence. "Subject selection criteria for maternal contributor. High empathy scores, minimum 85th percentile. Nurturing behavior demonstrations. Strong ethical framework. Intuitive emotional intelligence. Optimal candidate will have family history free from violence or criminal behavior, creating clear control conditions for observing potential genetic transmission through paternal line only." I closed my eyes. He was planning to have a child all along, to use that child as a test case. "Yes," she said quietly. "Me." In another folder, we found what appeared to be a research protocol, detailed plans for observing and documenting a child's development from birth through adolescence, with particular attention to markers of empathy, aggression, and moral reasoning. Notes on how to create controlled stress tests to assess the child's responses. Methodology for determining whether nature or nurture would prevail. "He was going to experiment on me," Cassidy whispered, her face pale. "Systematically, for years. But he never got the chance," I reminded her, reaching for her hand. "He was arrested when you were only 7 months old." She nodded, but her eyes remained haunted. What if he hadn't been caught? What kind of childhood would I have had? What kind of tests would he have subjected me to? I couldn't answer. The possibilities were too terrible to contemplate. We continued through the materials, finding letters from colleagues questioning Daniel's research ethics, notes from university review boards requesting modifications to his proposed studies, and his increasingly sophisticated rebuttals and workarounds. Then, in the third box, Cassidy found something that made her gasp. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." She handed me a thin file labeled Contingency Planning. Inside were detailed instructions for what should happen if Daniel's primary research was interrupted, if he was arrested, institutionalized, or killed. The first pages contained legal maneuvers, financial arrangements, and academic provisions, standard contingency planning for a researcher concerned about his work. But the final pages were addressed directly to me. "To Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, circumstances have forced an interruption in our work together. You are likely feeling betrayed, confused, perhaps even repulsed by what you've learned about me. These reactions are natural, but ultimately irrelevant to the task at hand. My hands trembled as I continued reading. Our daughter represents the culmination of years of preparation and research, a unique opportunity to study the interplay of nature and nurture in the development of predatory tendencies. Your role remains as critical in my absence as it was in my presence. You were selected for your exceptional empathic capacity, your moral framework, and your protective instincts, qualities that make you the ideal counterbalance to my genetic contribution. I felt Cassidy's hand on my shoulder, steadying me as I read. You have two options, Eleanor. You may choose to continue our research, documenting Cassidy's development according to the protocols in my files, maintaining scientific objectivity while providing the nurturing environment I've designed. Or you may attempt to remove my influence entirely, to erase me from her consciousness, to deny her heritage, to bury the truth of her origins. I looked up at Cassidy, who nodded for me to continue. Should you choose the latter path, know that you will fail. The truth cannot remain buried forever. Moreover, you will be denying our daughter the opportunity to understand herself completely, to confront and possibly overcome the darker aspects of her inheritance through knowledge rather than ignorance. The final paragraph landed like a physical blow. Remember, Eleanor, you were chosen for this role precisely because of who you are. Your compassion, your ethical strength, your resilience. These are the qualities I require in the maternal influence for our experiment. Do not disappoint me by allowing fear to override the purpose for which I selected you. Cassidy carries my legacy regardless of your choices. The only question is whether she will do so in darkness or in light. It was signed simply, Daniel Blackwood, Ph.D., with a date 3 months before his arrest. I set the paper down, feeling a strange calm replace the initial shock. Daniel had anticipated everything. My horror, my protective instincts, my impulse to shield Cassidy from the truth. He had even predicted my exact response. The creation of Thomas Mitchell, the relocation, the elaborate fiction constructed to give Cassidy a normal life, and he had declared it would ultimately fail. He knew, Cassidy said softly. He knew you would try to protect me by hiding the truth, and he knew eventually I would discover it. Yes, I acknowledged. He thought he could control us both, even from prison, that we would remain pawns in his experiment, one way or another. We sat in silence, the weight of Daniel's manipulation hanging heavy between us. Then Cassidy began to laugh, a small, incredulous sound that grew until tears streamed down her face. What? I asked, concerned. Don't you see? She managed between bursts of laughter. He failed. Completely, utterly failed. What do you mean? She gestured to the papers spread across the table. His grand experiment. His hypothesis that I would inherit his predatory tendencies, that I would carry his legacy, regardless of environment. He was wrong. I watched her, this brilliant, compassionate young woman, who had indeed inherited Daniel's intelligence but none of his cruelty. And his manipulation of you, she continued, wiping tears from her eyes. Yes, he chose you for your empathy and protective instincts, but he didn't understand what those qualities really meant. He saw them as variables in an experiment. He didn't realize they were actual human strengths that would ultimately defeat his purpose. She was right. Daniel had selected me believing my empathy made me malleable, my protective instincts predictable, my ethical framework a useful counterbalance to his nature. He had seen these qualities as components in his experiment, rather than as the very forces that would ensure its failure. He thought he was using your strengths, Cassidy said, taking my hands. But those strengths are what saved me, what saved us both. In that moment, sitting amid the evidence of Daniel's meticulous, monstrous planning, I felt something shift inside me, a weight lifting, a shadow receding. For 23 years, I had carried the burden of Daniel's manipulation, believing my naivety, my trust, my love had been weaknesses he exploited. Now I saw the truth, my capacity for love, for protection, for sacrifice. The very qualities Daniel had selected for his experiment had been the source of my power all along, the power that had enabled me to take his daughter and raise her into a woman who repudiated everything he stood for, the power that had turned his legacy into his ultimate defeat. He never understood love, I said softly. That was his blind spot. He could analyze it, categorize it, manipulate it, but he couldn't comprehend it as a force more powerful than his control. Cassidy smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. And that's why we won, Mom. Why we'll always win. We carefully repacked the archival boxes, thanked the archivist, and walked out into the December twilight, snow falling gently around us. For the first time since Daniel's arrest, I felt truly free of his shadow. Not because I had escaped it, but because I had finally turned to face it and discovered it held no power over me. What now? I asked as we stood beside our cars. Cassidy looked thoughtful. I'm still going to speak at that symposium, but not as a victim or a curiosity. I'm going to speak as someone who understands both the science and the humanity of this story. And after that, she smiled. I'm coming home for Christmas, if that's okay. More than okay, I said, my heart full. As we embraced in the falling snow, I realized that Daniel had been right about one thing only. The truth could not remain buried forever. What he hadn't understood was that when finally unearthed, that truth would not destroy us but set us free. The power had been ours all along. The symposium was scheduled for January 15th at Boston University. Criminal Psychology, New Frontiers in Understanding Predatory Behavior. Cassidy would be speaking on a panel about the impact of violent crime on families, alongside a detective, a victim advocate, and a forensic psychiatrist specializing in psychopathy. Are you nervous? I asked during one of our increasingly frequent phone calls. Christmas had come and gone. A quiet, healing time at home where we had begun the delicate process of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than protection. Terrified, she admitted, but also ready. I've been working with my therapist on what to say, how much to share, how to own this part of my story without letting it define me. Do you want me to be there? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. This was her journey now. I couldn't control it or protect her from it any longer. Actually, she said hesitantly, I was hoping you might consider joining me on the panel. The request caught me completely off guard. Me? But I'm not an expert. That's exactly why you should be there, she insisted. You have a perspective no one else has. What it means to love someone who turns out to be a predator. How to rebuild a life after that kind of betrayal. How to protect a child from that legacy. I felt a familiar impulse to refuse, to retreat into the shadows of anonymity I'd cultivated for so long. Then I remembered Daniel's letter, his certainty that fear would guide my choices, that I would choose darkness over light. Okay, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. I'll do it. Cassidy's exhale of relief was audible through the phone. Really? You're sure? No, I said honestly. I'm terrified too, but I'm tired of hiding, Cassidy. Tired of letting Daniel's actions dictate how we live our lives. The symposium organizer, a prominent criminologist who had written extensively on serial predators, was initially skeptical about adding me to the panel. Mrs. Mitchell, while your personal connection is compelling, this is primarily an academic conference. We're looking for perspectives grounded in research or professional experience. With all due respect, I replied during our video call, Cassidy sitting supportively beside me. I have lived experience that directly informs your research. I was married to a predator who selected me specifically for my psychological profile. I raised a child he considered part of his research, and I've spent 2 decades observing the long-term impacts of violent crime on families. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. You make a compelling point, and having both mother and daughter perspectives would be uniquely valuable. Let me speak with the committee. 2 days later, we received confirmation. Both Cassidy and I would be speaking on the panel. Preparation became our shared project, a bridge rebuilding the connection between us that Daniel's secrets had damaged. We spent hours on video calls drafting our remarks, discussing what aspects of our story to share, how to frame our experiences in ways that might help others without sensationalizing the horror of what Daniel had done. I don't want this to be about him, Cassidy insisted during one session. He's had enough attention, enough power over our narrative. Agreed, I said. This should be about resilience, about reclaiming our story. We decided I would speak first, providing context about the years of deception and protection, the conscious choice to create Thomas Mitchell, rather than letting Daniel Blackwood's shadow define Cassidy's childhood. Then Cassidy would speak about discovering the truth, confronting her biological father, and her journey toward integrating this knowledge into her sense of self. Neither of us would mention Daniel's experiment, or his plans for Cassidy. Some truths were still too personal, too painful to share publicly. but we would acknowledge his deliberate selection of me as a partner, his calculated use of academic credentials as cover, and the devastating impact of his crimes on multiple families, including our own. As January approached, our preparation intensified. I took a leave of absence from the library to focus on my presentation. Cassidy drove down from Boston on weekends, and we worked side by side at the kitchen table that had once held fabricated mementos of Thomas Mitchell, but now displayed the honest artifacts of our journey, the symposium program, our draft remarks, articles on transgenerational trauma, and family resilience. One snowy evening, as we were finalizing our presentations, Cassidy looked up from her laptop with a thoughtful expression. "We should reach out to them," she said. "Who?" "The families of Daniel's victims. Emily Chen, Zoe Martinez, Kimberly Watson. We're going to be speaking publicly about our experience. They deserve to know, to have a chance to object if this would be painful for them." I stared at my daughter, humbled by her ethical clarity. In my focus on protecting her, I had sometimes lost sight of the other victims in this story. The young women whose lives Daniel had taken, the families left with grief rather than complicated secrets. "You're right," I said. "Absolutely right. But how do we find them?" "I already have," she admitted. "I've been researching the cases, trying to understand the full impact of what he did. The Chen family still lives in Seattle. The Martinezes moved to California. The Watsons are in Oregon now. The fact that Cassidy had been quietly doing this research, that she had been considering the wider circle of pain caused by Daniel, filled me with a complex mix of pride and sadness. She had inherited my empathy, but applied it with a courage I had sometimes lacked. "What do we say to them?" I asked. "The truth," she said simply. "That we're speaking at this symposium, that we're trying to reclaim our narrative while respecting theirs, that if they feel our participation would cause them pain, we'll withdraw." We drafted the letters together, careful, compassionate messages acknowledging the unbridgeable gulf between our experiences, but offering respect and recognition of their loss. We sent them by certified mail, including our contact information, and a sincere invitation to respond in whatever way felt right to them. 2 weeks passed, with no response. Then, 3 days before the symposium, I received an email from Margaret Chen, Emily's mother. "Mrs. Mitchell," it began. "Thank you for your letter regarding the upcoming symposium. After much thought, my husband and I want you to know that we bear no ill will toward you or your daughter. We have always understood that Daniel Blackwood victimized many people, yourselves included, though in different ways than he victimized our Emily. We appreciate your consideration in reaching out to us and support your effort to speak your truth." The email continued with a brief update on their lives, how they had established a scholarship in Emily's name, how they had struggled but survived the devastating loss of their daughter. It ended with a request. If possible, we would appreciate it if you would acknowledge that behind the academic discussions of predatory behavior are real victims with names and stories of their own. Emily was studying to be a pediatrician. She loved classical piano and volunteering at animal shelters. She was not just a case study or a statistic, she was our daughter. I read the email to Cassidy over the phone, both of us in tears by the end. "We have to honor her request," Cassidy said immediately. "For all of them." "Yes," I agreed. "We'll make sure they're remembered as people, not just victims." Similar responses came from the Martinez and Watson families, grief tempered by unexpected grace, acknowledgement of our different but connected traumas, and requests that their daughters be remembered as full human beings, not merely as victims of Daniel Blackwood. The night before the symposium, Cassidy stayed at my house. We sat up late, making final adjustments to our presentations, practicing our remarks, preparing ourselves emotionally for the public unveiling of our long-held secrets. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked as we sat by the fire in our living room, mugs of tea warming our hands. "Once we do this, we can't take it back. People will know." "I'm sure," she said, her expression resolute. "I'm done living in his shadow, Mom. Done pretending to be someone I'm not. And you're not worried about how people might react? The judgment, the curiosity, the assumptions they might make about you because of him?" She considered this, gazing into the flames. "I'm worried," she admitted, "but I'm more worried about what happens if I keep hiding, if I let shame control my choices, if I continue to act as if his blood in my veins is something to be ashamed of, rather than something I've overcome." I studied my daughter in the firelight, Her straight posture, her determined expression, her clear eyes that might have been Daniel's in color but were entirely her own in the compassion they held. In her face, I could see echoes of the young woman I had been before Daniel, hopeful, principled, unafraid, but strengthened by a wisdom I had gained only through painful experience. "What about you?" she asked. "Are you ready to be known as Eleanor Blackwood again? After all these years as Eleanor Mitchell?" "I was never really Eleanor Blackwood," I said slowly, realizing the truth as I spoke it. "I was Eleanor Winters before I met him. I was always Eleanor, the woman he selected for her empathy and strength, the woman who survived him, the woman who protected you and rebuilt our lives. Tomorrow I'm not reclaiming his name. I'm reclaiming my story." Cassidy smiled, reaching across to take my hand. "Our story," she corrected gently. "Our story," I agreed. We rose early the next morning, dressed in the outfits we had carefully selected, professional but not severe, dignified but not somber. As we prepared to leave for Boston, I noticed Cassidy placing something in her bag, the photograph of Daniel and me that she had found in the metal box months ago, the discovery that had set all of this in motion. "Why are you bringing that?" I asked. "As a reminder," she said, "of how far we've come, of what we've overcome." The drive to Boston was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The symposium was being held in a modern auditorium on the Boston University campus, already buzzing with academics, psychology students, and professionals in the field when we arrived. We checked in at the registration desk, receiving name badges that identified us simply as E. Mitchell and C. Mitchell, with our positions on the panel. For a moment, the anonymity of these labels was reassuring. One last shield before our public unveiling. Dr. Robert Feldman, the symposium organizer who had initially been skeptical about my participation, greeted us in the speaker's lounge. "Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell, thank you for joining us today. I've reviewed your remarks and found them quite powerful." "Thank you," I said, noting his slightly uncomfortable expression. "Is something wrong?" He hesitated. "We've had an unexpected development. A request from another institution to record the panel for educational purposes. Given the sensitive nature of your presentations, I wanted to check if you're comfortable with this." Cassidy and I exchanged glances. "Which institution?" she asked. "The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit," he said. "They use case studies in training their analysts. Your perspective, both of you, offers insight they rarely have access to." Another glance between us, a silent communication born of our months of preparation together. Then Cassidy nodded slightly, and I turned back to Dr. Feldman. "Yes," I said. "We're comfortable with that." As we took our seats on the stage an hour later, me next to the victim advocate, Cassidy beside the forensic psychiatrist, I felt a strange calm replace the anxiety that had built over the previous weeks. The auditorium was full, faces turned expectantly toward the panel. Somewhere in that audience, our story would find its purpose, perhaps helping another family navigating a similar path, perhaps informing professionals who could prevent future tragedies, perhaps simply bearing witness to the possibility of resilience after betrayal. Dr. Feldman introduced the panel, saving us for last. And finally, we are honored to welcome Eleanor and Cassidy Mitchell, who bring a unique and profound perspective to our discussion. Eleanor is the former wife, and Cassidy the daughter of Daniel Blackwood, whose case many of you will be familiar with from the criminology literature. They have graciously agreed to share their experience of rebuilding lives in the aftermath of his crimes. A murmur ran through the audience. Recognition, surprise, a ripple of heightened attention. I felt Cassidy straighten beside me, her chin lifting slightly. The detective spoke first, outlining the investigative challenges of identifying predators who hide behind respectable facades. The victim advocate followed, discussing the complex trauma experienced by families of both victims and perpetrators. The forensic psychiatrist explained the latest research on psychopathic traits and their manifestations. Then it was my turn. I looked out at the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell, formerly Eleanor Blackwood, formerly Eleanor Winters. 23 years ago, I discovered that the man I loved, the father of my infant daughter, was responsible for the deaths of 3 young women." My voice, to my surprise, was steady. The words I had rehearsed flowed naturally, neither clinical nor overly emotional, but honest. I spoke about the shock of discovery, the complex grief of losing not just a husband but my entire understanding of the life we had shared, I explained my decision to create Thomas Mitchell, acknowledging both the protection it had offered Cassidy and the costs of maintaining such an elaborate deception. I spoke of the families of Emily, Zoe, and Kimberly, honoring my promise to Margaret Chen by describing their daughters as the full, complex human beings they had been, not merely as victims. I acknowledged that while my trauma was real, it was different from and not comparable to their devastating loss. And I spoke, briefly but clearly, about Daniel's deliberate selection of me for specific psychological traits, his calculated use of my empathy and trust as components in his cover. What Daniel Blackwood failed to understand, I concluded, was that the very qualities he sought to exploit became the source of resilience that allowed us to survive him. Love, empathy, and the capacity for growth are not weaknesses to be manipulated, but strengths that can overcome even the darkest legacy. I turned to Cassidy, passing her the metaphorical baton. Our eyes met briefly, mother and daughter, survivors together, before she faced the audience. I grew up believing my father was an architect named Thomas Mitchell, who died before I was born, she began. I learned the truth only months ago, when I discovered evidence my mother had preserved. As Cassidy spoke, eloquent, thoughtful, occasionally vulnerable but never victimized, I watched the audience lean forward in their seats. They were captivated not by the sensational aspects of our story, but by the human journey she described. The shock of discovering her true paternity, the confrontation with Daniel in prison, the painful but necessary integration of this knowledge into her sense of self. Daniel Blackwood may have contributed to my DNA, she said toward the end of her remarks, but he does not define me. My identity is shaped far more by the mother who protected me, the values she instilled, and the choices I make every day to use my understanding of this dark legacy to bring light rather than shadow into the world. As the panel concluded and we opened for questions, I realized we had accomplished what we had set out to do. We had reclaimed our narrative, not by denying Daniel's influence on our lives, but by placing it in proper perspective, not as victims seeking pity, but as survivors offering insight, not in darkness, but in light. The questions were respectful, thoughtful, about resilient strategies, about the ethics of truth versus protection in families affected by violent crime, about the intersection of professional and personal identity for those connected to infamous cases. As the session ended and attendees approached the stage to speak with us individually, I noticed a woman in a dark suit waiting patiently at the edge of the group. When the crowd thinned, she stepped forward, presenting a business card. Special Agent Karen Martinez, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, she introduced herself. Thank you both for sharing your experience today. Your perspective is invaluable to our work. I'm glad it was helpful, I said cautiously. More than helpful, she said. Potentially groundbreaking. We study these offenders extensively, but rarely gain insight from those who knew them intimately before their crimes were discovered. Your observations about how Daniel Blackwood selected and manipulated those around him could help us identify similar patterns in other cases. She hesitated, then continued. We would like to invite you both to Quantico to speak with our analysts. Not just about Daniel specifically, but about your experiences, the warning signs you recognize in retrospect, the manipulation tactics he employed, the selection criteria he used in both his victims and his personal relationships. Cassidy and I exchanged glances. You want us to help catch others like him? Cassidy said. Not a question, but a realization. Yes, Agent Martinez confirmed. Your experiences, painful as they were, have given you insights that could help prevent similar tragedies. As we left the auditorium later that afternoon, walking together through the January cold to our car, I felt a shift in the weight I had carried for 23 years. The burden hadn't disappeared. The truth of what Daniel had done, of how he had used me, of what he had intended for Cassidy would always be part of our history. But that burden was transforming from a secret shame into something else, a hard-won wisdom that might now serve a purpose beyond our own healing. What do you think about the FBI invitation? I asked Cassidy as we drove home. She was quiet for a moment, watching the winter landscape pass outside her window. I think it's the first time I've felt that something good might come from being Daniel Blackwood's daughter, that the very connection I've been struggling with could become useful, could help protect others. I reached across to squeeze her hand. For what it's worth, I think you're right. That night, back in our home, the home that had housed our secrets for so long, but now felt oddly lighter. We sat together planning not just our presentation for Quantico, but a new direction for both our lives. Cassidy would continue her studies, but with a focus on victimology and resilience rather than criminal psychology. I would take what I had learned about protecting children from trauma and apply it more broadly in my work at the library, developing programs for children affected by family crisis. We were no longer hiding from Daniel Blackwood's legacy. We were transforming it, turning the darkest chapter of our lives into a source of insight, compassion, and perhaps even prevention. The counterattack Daniel had never anticipated was not against him personally, but against everything he represented: the manipulation of trust, the exploitation of vulnerability, the calculated cruelty he had disguised behind intelligence and charm. And the weapons in this counterattack were precisely the qualities he had dismissed as weaknesses to be exploited: empathy, honesty, resilience, and the courage to stand in the light with our full, complicated truth. February brought a letter from Centennial Correctional Facility, the same official envelope that had upended our lives months earlier. This time, I opened it immediately, standing in my kitchen on a gray winter morning, refusing to give it power through fear or avoidance. Inmate Daniel Blackwood has requested a family visitation with Eleanor Mitchell and Cassidy Mitchell, the form letter stated. Please indicate your response on the enclosed form. No personal note this time. No letter addressed to my daughter, just a bureaucratic request that nevertheless sent a chill through me. I called Cassidy immediately. He's requesting to see us, both of us. Why now? She asked, the wariness in her voice matching my own. The symposium, I realized. He must have heard about it somehow, maybe from another inmate with outside connections, or a guard who recognized our names. Or the FBI visit, Cassidy added. We had gone to Quantico the previous week, spending 2 days with the Behavioral Analysis Unit, sharing our experiences and insights. The sessions had been recorded for training purposes. Daniel, with his academic connections, might still have contacts who would have heard about it. What do you want to do? I asked, determined to let Cassidy take the lead in this decision. I had made enough unilateral choices about Daniel's place in our lives. She was quiet for a long moment. I think we should go, she said finally. Together. One last time. Are you sure? I couldn't keep the concern from my voice. Your last visit with him was difficult. It was, she acknowledged. But I wasn't prepared then. I was in shock, vulnerable, and I was alone. This time would be different. She was right. Everything was different now. We had publicly claimed our connection to Daniel while simultaneously defining ourselves beyond it. We had transformed our personal trauma into professional insight. We had stepped out of the shadows of secrecy into the clarity of truth. Okay, I agreed. We'll go, together. We scheduled the visit for March 15th, a date that would give us time to prepare psychologically, while not allowing Daniel's request to hang over us indefinitely. We worked with our therapists, both individually and in joint sessions, to establish clear boundaries for the interaction, to anticipate manipulation tactics, to strengthen our unified front. Remember, Dr. Levine, my therapist, advised during our final preparatory session, Daniel thrives on creating division, on finding vulnerabilities he can exploit. Your strongest protection is your connection to each other. The morning of the visit, Cassidy and I flew to Denver together, rented a car, and drove the long stretch of highway to the remote prison complex. We barely spoke during the journey, each of us gathering our strength for the confrontation ahead. At the prison, we underwent the rigorous security procedures, surrendering our belongings, passing through metal detectors, being searched by expressionless guards. The processing officer recognized Cassidy from her previous visit. Back again? He said, raising an eyebrow as he checked her ID. With reinforcements this time, she replied, nodding toward me. He glanced between us, noting the resemblance. Good luck in there, he said, his tone softening slightly. Remember the rules. No physical contact with the inmate, no passing of items, no discussion of his case details or other inmates. The visit will be monitored at all times. We were led to a visitation room different from the general area, a small, stark space with a table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs, one on one side, 2 on the other. A guard would remain posted just outside the door, visible through a reinforced window. High security protocol, the escorting officer explained. Given the inmate's history and profile, we took our seats side by side, facing the empty chair across the table. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure Cassidy could hear it, but my resolve remained firm. I was no longer the naive young librarian who had fallen under Daniel's spell, nor the frightened young mother who had fled Seattle with an infant. I was Eleanor Mitchell, survivor, protector, truth-teller. The door on the opposite side of the room opened, and Daniel Blackwood entered, escorted by 2 guards who positioned him in the chair and then retreated to stand against the wall behind him. 23 years had changed him less than I expected. His dark hair was now gray at the temples, lines had formed around his eyes and mouth, and prison life had hardened his once academic physique. But his eyes, those brilliant blue eyes that had passed to Cassidy, remained unnervingly the same. Intelligent, observant, calculating. He looked first at Cassidy, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, then shifted his gaze to me. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps at seeing me there, or at the change in me that he could surely perceive. "Eleanor," he said, his voice still carrying the same cultured tone I remembered. "This is unexpected. A family reunion after all these years." "Daniel?" I replied, my voice steady. "You look well," he commented, studying me. "Time has been kind to you. And to you, Cassidy. You've grown into a remarkable young woman." "Why did you request this visit?" Cassidy asked, cutting through the pleasantries with direct efficiency. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed despite the institutional setting. "I heard about your recent public appearances, the symposium at Boston University, the consultation with the FBI. It seems my 2 favorite subjects have emerged from hiding at last." The word subjects hung in the air between us, a deliberate reminder of how he had viewed us all along. "We're not your subjects, Daniel," I said calmly. "We never were. Not really." He tilted his head, studying me with clinical interest. "No? Then what would you call our relationship, Eleanor? Our family unit was designed with specific parameters, specific purposes. By you," I acknowledged, "without my knowledge or consent. But your design failed." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the first crack in his composed facade. "Did it? You're both here, aren't you? Shaped by my actions, defined by your connection to me, famous now, precisely because of who I am. That hardly seems like failure." Cassidy leaned forward slightly. "Is that why you wanted to see us? To claim credit for our resilience? To suggest that our ability to survive what you did somehow validates your experiment?" Daniel's smile returned, appreciative of her directness. "You have my analytical mind, Cassidy. I noticed that during our first meeting, the ability to cut through emotional distraction to the core question. Answer the question," she pressed, unmoved by the manipulation. He shrugged slightly. "I was curious. The reports I heard described a very different scenario than I had anticipated. You speaking openly about your connection to me. Eleanor acknowledging our marriage without the shame and denial I expected. Both of you using your experiences to inform professionals in the field." His eyes narrowed slightly. "It represents a significant deviation from the projected outcomes." "You mean we didn't follow your script," I clarified. "We didn't remain trapped in shame and secrecy. We didn't allow you to control our narrative from behind these walls." "Precisely," he agreed, as if we were having an academic discussion rather than confronting the wreckage of lives he had damaged. "It's an unexpected adaptation. Fascinating, really." "We're not adapting to your experiment," Cassidy said firmly. "We've rejected it entirely. We've chosen to define ourselves beyond your influence, to use what happened not as victims but as experts." Daniel studied her, his expression calculating. "And yet here you are, seeking my reaction, my recognition. If you've truly moved beyond my influence, why come today? Why respond to my request at all?" It was the trap I had anticipated, the suggestion that our very presence proved his continued relevance, his continued control. "Closure," I said simply. "Not for you, Daniel. For us. To look you in the eye as the people we've become, not the people you tried to make us." "And what people are those, Eleanor?" he asked, his tone almost gentle but his eyes sharp. "The perfect maternal influence? The empathic counterbalance to my nature? The protective force I selected specifically for those qualities? Those qualities are real," I acknowledged. "But your mistake was believing they made me weak, malleable, controllable. You selected me for my empathy, because you thought it made me vulnerable to manipulation. What you never understood is that empathy, properly directed, is strength. It's connection. It's the very thing that allowed me to save our daughter from your toxic influence. For the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed Daniel's face, a flicker of uncertainty, perhaps even respect. "And what about you, Cassidy?" he asked, turning to her. "Have you come to terms with your genetic inheritance? With the darkness in your blood that calls to you when you study the criminal mind?" Cassidy met his gaze unflinchingly. "There is no darkness in my blood, Daniel. That's not how psychology works, as you well know. Your academic research on genetic predisposition to violence was methodologically flawed, built on outdated concepts of biological determinism that have been thoroughly debunked. I watched with pride as my daughter dismantled her father's manipulations with precise academic language, fighting him on his own terrain. What shapes us is not genetic destiny, but a complex interplay of biology, environment, and above all, choice," she continued. "I chose empathy. I chose ethics. I chose to use my interest in criminal psychology to help victims, not to exploit them." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Yet you cannot deny a certain fascination with darkness, a curiosity about the minds of those who breach social boundaries. Why else pursue criminal psychology if not drawn by some recognition, some internal resonance?" "Perhaps," Cassidy conceded, surprising me. "I am drawn to understanding extreme behavior, to exploring the boundaries of human capacity for both harm and healing. But that curiosity isn't your legacy, Daniel. It's a human trait, shared by thousands of researchers, therapists, and law enforcement professionals who use it constructively rather than destructively." She leaned forward, her voice lowering slightly. "The difference between us isn't in our capacity to recognize darkness. It's in what we choose to do with that recognition. You chose to embrace it. I choose to illuminate it, to study it from a position of compassion rather than participation." A silence fell over the room. Not uncomfortable, but weighted, as if the air itself had changed density. Daniel looked between us, his clinical detachment momentarily replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Not remorse. I doubted he was capable of that, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement that his control had limits, that his experiment had yielded results he hadn't anticipated. "I underestimated you," he said finally, directing the comment to both of us. "An unusual error in my calculations?" "You underestimated love," I corrected. "It was the variable your equations couldn't account for, the force your experiments couldn't measure." He dismissed this with a slight wave of his hand, retreating from genuine connection back to academic distance. "A poetic interpretation, Eleanor. Always your tendency to sentimentalize complex psychological phenomena." "Call it what you want," Cassidy interjected. "The result is the same. Your attempt to create a legacy of darkness failed. Your attempt to control our lives from prison failed. Your expectation that we would remain forever defined by our connection to you has failed." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet, I remain a central figure in your narrative. The reason for your public speaking, your FBI consultation, this very visit. Perhaps not the legacy I envisioned, but a legacy nonetheless. A cautionary tale," I countered. "A chapter in our lives, not the whole story. You're right that we will always carry the fact of our connection to you. It shaped us, challenged us, forced us to become stronger than we might otherwise have been. But that connection doesn't define us any more than a scar defines a survivor." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. "Impressive adaptation," he said, his academic tone returning. "Both of you. Far more successful than projected." He turned to Cassidy. "You've rejected direct contact with me, yet you've made our connection public. Why? What purpose does that public acknowledgement serve for you?" "Authenticity," she replied without hesitation. "I spent 23 years living with a fictional father. I won't spend the rest of my life denying my biological one, not out of any desire for connection with you, but because I refuse to build my identity on lies, even well-intentioned ones." She glanced at me briefly, not accusatory but understanding, before continuing. "By acknowledging you publicly, I take control of the narrative. I transform what could be a shameful secret into a source of perspective. I use the very thing that might have destroyed me to help others." Daniel nodded. something like scholarly approval in his expression. Resourceful, adaptive, using potential vulnerability as a strength. He glanced between us. Nature or nurture, I wonder. The resilience you both demonstrate, my genetic contribution or Eleanor's environmental influence. Both and neither, I said firmly. Cassidy is her own person, Daniel. Not your experiment, not my creation. A human being with agency, with choices, with a moral compass that points true despite everything. The guard at the door shifted position, signaling that our time was growing short. One last question, Daniel said, leaning forward slightly. If you could go back, Eleanor, knowing everything you know now, would you still create Thomas Mitchell? Still build that elaborate fiction to protect our daughter? Or would you choose honesty from the beginning? It was the question I had asked myself countless times over the past months, the ethical dilemma at the heart of our story. I felt Cassidy's attention shift to me, curious about my answer. I don't know, I admitted, choosing honesty over certainty. I acted out of love, out of a desperate desire to protect, but I've seen now how even well-intentioned deception creates its own damage. I glanced at Cassidy. What I do know is that I would choose her welfare over my own, then and now. The method might change, but the purpose would remain the same. Daniel seemed to consider this, then turned to Cassidy. And you? Would you have preferred the truth from the beginning? To grow up as Daniel Blackwood's daughter rather than Thomas Mitchell's? Cassidy didn't hesitate. I would have preferred a world where you made different choices, where Emily and Zoe and Kimberly lived full lives, where my mother wasn't forced into an impossible position because of your actions. Her voice remained steady, powerful in its clarity. But given the reality you created, I understand why she made the choice she did. And I can't say with certainty that I would have been better off knowing from childhood that my father was a killer. She reached over and took my hand, a gesture of solidarity that brought tears to my eyes. What I do know is that I'm grateful for the love that motivated her choices, even when those choices were imperfect. And I'm proud of the strength it took for her to protect me, to rebuild our lives, to face you now without fear. Daniel watched our joined hands with an expression I couldn't read, perhaps the closest thing to genuine emotion he was capable of experiencing. For a moment, I glimpsed not the calculated predator or the clinical researcher, but simply a man confronting the consequences of his actions. The lives that had continued without him, the connections he could observe but never truly understand. Time's up, the guard announced, moving toward Daniel. As they prepared to lead him away, Daniel looked at us one last time. Nature, nurture, choice. Whatever the combination, the result is unexpected, fascinating. His gaze lingered on Cassidy. You would have made an exceptional research subject. I'm not your subject, she replied calmly. I'm your daughter, and that means something entirely different than what you intended. As the door closed behind him, Cassidy and I remained seated, still holding hands, the weight of the encounter settling around us. Are you okay? I asked softly. She nodded, her expression thoughtful rather than distressed. I am. Better than I expected. He doesn't have power over me, over us anymore. No, I agreed, he doesn't. Outside, in the harsh Colorado sunlight, we stood in the prison parking lot looking back at the concrete fortress that contained Daniel Blackwood, the man who had tried to define our lives, but had ultimately failed. Do you think we'll ever see him again? Cassidy asked. I considered the question carefully. I don't know, but if we do, it will be because we choose to, not because he manipulates us into it. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. What now? Now, I said, putting my arm around her shoulders as we walked to our rental car. We go home. We continue the work we've started. We live our lives fully, authentically, without his shadow hanging over us. As we drove away from Centennial Correctional Facility, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the prison receding behind us. Daniel would remain there until his death. His physical freedom permanently revoked because of the choices he had made, the lives he had taken, the trust he had violated. But the psychological prison he had tried to create for Cassidy and me, the cage of shame, secrecy, and genetic determinism, that we had escaped, not by denying our connection to him, but by reclaiming it on our own terms, not by hiding from the truth, but by transforming it into a source of insight, resilience, and even purpose. The confrontation was over. The public discovery of our story had already happened. What remained now was the future we would build, a future defined not by Daniel Blackwood's darkness, but by our own light. 1 year later, I stood at the podium in a sunlit auditorium at Columbia University, looking out at a sea of attentive faces. Students, faculty, mental health professionals, and law enforcement officers gathered for the inaugural conference on family resilience after violent crime. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice steady with a confidence I had earned through months of similar presentations. "My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and my journey to this stage began 24 years ago, when I discovered that my husband, Daniel Blackwood, was responsible for the murders of 3 young women. The story no longer caught in my throat as it once had. The shame that had once accompanied these words had transformed into something else. Not pride, exactly, but a steady acceptance of this chapter in my life, as neither defining nor diminishing me. Many of you know the outline of our story, the elaborate fiction I created to protect my daughter from the shadow of her father's crimes, the eventual discovery of that deception, and our journey toward a new kind of truth. What I want to share today is not that familiar narrative, but what has come after. The rebuilding, the reintegration, the reclamation of our lives on our own terms. In the front row, Cassidy smiled encouragingly. Now 24, she had graduated from Harvard with honors and was pursuing a law degree at Columbia, specializing in advocacy for children affected by family trauma. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional knot, her blue eyes clear and focused. Those eyes that had once terrified me as a reminder of Daniel, but now I saw simply as hers, bright with intelligence and compassion. The past year had transformed both of us. After our final confrontation with Daniel, we had channeled our experiences into creating resources that didn't exist when we needed them most: a support network for families of violent offenders, educational materials for mental health professionals working with children of incarcerated parents, training programs for law enforcement on recognizing manipulation tactics in seemingly normal family systems. What had begun as personal healing had expanded into professional purpose. The FBI had contracted us as regular consultants for their behavioral analysis unit. Universities invited us to speak to psychology and criminology students. Mental health organizations sought our input on treatment protocols. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate is rarely linear, I continued, clicking to advance my presentation slides. For many families affected by violent crime, there is no roadmap, no guidebook for navigating the complex terrain of trauma, identity, and recovery. I outlined the program we had developed, a comprehensive approach to family resilience that acknowledged both the damage of violent crime and the possibility of meaningful recovery. Not through denial or magical thinking, but through honest confrontation with reality, strategic support, and the careful construction of new narratives that neither erase the past nor remain trapped within it. What we have learned, I said, approaching my conclusion, is that resilience is not about getting over trauma or relegating it to ancient history. It's about integration, weaving the reality of what happened into the fabric of who we are without allowing it to dominate the pattern of our lives. As the presentation ended and applause filled the auditorium, I felt a familiar sense of gratitude wash over me, not just for surviving what Daniel had done, but for finding purpose in its aftermath, for transforming what could have been a life sentence of shame and secrecy into a source of connection, insight, and even hope for others walking similar paths. The Q&A session that followed was thoughtful, engaged, occasionally challenging in ways that pushed my thinking further. A young psychology student asked about the ethics of deception versus truth when protecting children from traumatic knowledge. A veteran detective inquired about early warning signs of manipulation in seemingly normal relationships. A social worker questioned how to balance a child's right to know their origins with their need for psychological safety. I answered as honestly as I could, acknowledging the complexity of these issues, refusing to offer simplistic solutions to problems that defied easy answers. When appropriate, I deferred to Cassidy, whose perspective as the child in our story provided insights I could never access through my experience alone. As the session concluded, and attendees gathered in small groups for the networking reception, I watched Cassidy in her element, confident, articulate, moving easily between conversations with professors, FBI agents, and mental health professionals. No trace remained of the devastated young woman who had discovered her father's identity in a criminology class 2 years earlier. "You must be very proud," said a voice beside me. I turned to find Margaret Chen, Emily's mother, standing there with a gentle smile. After our panel at Boston University, the Chen family had reached out, initiating a careful, tentative connection that had gradually deepened into something like friendship. Not based on shared experience, our traumas were too different for that, but on mutual respect for each other's journeys through the aftermath of Daniel's actions. I acknowledged, watching Cassidy across the room. Sometimes I can hardly believe she's the same person who was so shattered by the truth just 2 years ago. Margaret nodded, her own gaze following Cassidy. She has your strength, not his darkness. The simple statement, coming from a woman who had lost her daughter to Daniel's violence, moved me deeply. Thank you for saying that, I said softly, and for being here today. Your support means more than I can express. Our paths crossed for terrible reasons, Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. But what we build from that crossing, that's our choice. Emily would have wanted her death to mean something, to perhaps prevent others from experiencing similar loss. She had brought photographs of Emily to share at the conference, not as a victim, but as the vibrant young woman she had been, studying to become a pediatrician, playing classical piano, volunteering at animal shelters. These images were displayed alongside photographs of Zoe Martinez and Kimberly Watson, reminding everyone that behind the academic discussions of predatory behavior were real lives with dreams, talents, and futures that had been violently interrupted. The Memorial Scholarship has funded 5 medical students now, Margaret told me, pride evident in her voice, each one planning to work with underserved children. Emily's legacy continues in the lives they'll touch. We spoke for a while longer about our respective projects, our families, the unexpected connections that had formed through our shared commitment to creating meaning from tragedy. As Margaret moved on to speak with others, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Ms. Mitchell, a young woman in her early 20s, stood before me, clutching a notebook nervously. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to thank you for your presentation, and for everything, really. I'm glad it was helpful, I said, noting her intense expression. More than helpful, she said. Life-changing. She hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. My father is serving 20 years for attempted murder. I was 12 when he was arrested. My mother created a story about him dying in an accident to protect me, but I found out the truth last year. I've been struggling ever since with what that means for who I am. The parallels to our story were unmistakable. That must have been incredibly difficult, I said, giving her my full attention. It was. It still is, she admitted. But hearing you and Cassidy speak, seeing how you've reclaimed your narrative, how you've built something meaningful from something terrible, it's the first time I've felt hope that I'm not defined by his actions, that I can choose a different path. You absolutely can, I assured her. His choices are his alone. Your life is your own to shape. I'm studying criminal justice, she told me, a hint of defiance in her voice. My mother thinks it's unhealthy, that I'm obsessing over what he did, but it's not about him. It's about understanding systems, about maybe helping prevent others from going through what my family experienced. I recognized in her the same transformative impulse that had guided Cassidy, the desire not to deny the painful reality of her origins, but to integrate it into a purposeful future. Trust your instincts, I advised her. Only you can know what path of healing is right for you, but know you're not alone in this journey. I introduced her to Cassidy, watching as they connected immediately over their shared experience. 2 young women refusing to be defined by their father's crimes, transforming painful inheritance into purposeful direction. Later that evening, Cassidy and I had dinner at a small Italian restaurant near Columbia's campus, a quiet celebration of how far we had come. Did you ever imagine this? She asked as we lingered over dessert. That we'd be here, doing this work, having made peace with our past? I considered the question thoughtfully. No, I admitted. For 23 years, my only goal was protection, keeping the truth buried, keeping you safe from Daniel's shadow. I never envisioned a future where we would acknowledge him openly while refusing to be diminished by that connection. I'm glad we found this path, she said. As painful as the journey has been, so am I agreed. Though I still wish I could have spared you the shock of discovery. The way you found out was difficult, she acknowledged, but maybe necessary. Maybe there was no easy way to learn a truth that complicated. She was right, of course. Some revelations are inherently destabilizing, no matter how carefully delivered. The discovery that your father is a killer, that your mother has constructed an elaborate fiction about your origins. These are earthquakes in the foundation of identity, not minor tremors that can be easily absorbed. I've been thinking about what comes next, Cassidy said after a moment. For both of us. What do you mean? We've spent the past 2 years processing, integrating, sharing our story. It's been important work, necessary work, but at some point, we need to be more than Daniel Blackwood's ex-wife and daughter. I finished for her. Exactly, she said, looking relieved that I understood. I don't want to be defined by him forever, even in opposition. I want to build something that stands entirely on its own. I reached across the table to take her hand. You will. You already are. Your legal studies, your advocacy work, those aren't just reactions to Daniel. They're expressions of who you are, who you've always been. She smiled, squeezing my hand. And what about you, Mom? What do you want for yourself beyond this chapter of our lives? The question caught me off guard. For 24 years, my identity had been shaped primarily around motherhood, around protection, around carrying, and then revealing the truth about Daniel. I had defined myself in relation to others: wife, mother, survivor, advocate, but rarely in terms of my own desires independent of these roles. I'm not sure, I admitted. For so long, my focus has been on you, on our survival, on making meaning from what happened. I haven't thought much about who Eleanor Mitchell might be beyond that context. Maybe it's time, Cassidy suggested gently. You're only 50. There's a whole life waiting to be lived on your own terms. She was right. Again, my daughter, in her wisdom, was offering me the same freedom I had fought to give her. The chance to define myself beyond the shadow of Daniel Blackwood, beyond even the identity of his survivor or his exposer. I've been thinking about writing, I said, voicing an idea that had been forming gradually over months of speaking engagements and consultations. Not just our story, that's been told, but a broader exploration of resilience, of how people rebuild after devastating betrayal. Maybe even fiction that draws on psychological truths without being limited to our specific experience. Cassidy's face lit up. You'd be amazing at that. You've always had a gift for narrative, for finding meaning in experience. Remember all those bedtime stories you used to create for me? The elaborate worlds you built? I smiled at the memory, seeing for the first time how the same imaginative capacity that had allowed me to construct Thomas Mitchell's detailed backstory might be channeled into creative work of a different kind. Not deception, but exploration. Not protection, but illumination. Maybe I'll apply to the creative writing program at the community college, I mused. Start small, see where it leads. Do it, Cassidy encouraged. It's time for you to write your own story now, not just tell ours. As we left the restaurant and walked through the crisp autumn evening back toward Cassidy's apartment, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Not because the past had been erased or forgotten, but because it had finally found its proper place in the larger narrative of our lives, not defining us, not controlling us, but informing who we had become and the choices we would make going forward. Cassidy looped her arm through mine as we walked, a casual gesture of connection that spoke volumes about how far we had come from the broken trust of 2 years ago. You know, she said thoughtfully, in all those psychology classes, they taught us that trauma changes the brain, rewires neural pathways, affects how we process experience. For a long time, I thought that meant damage, limitation, scars that never fully heal. And now? I asked. Now, I think it's more complex than that. Yes, trauma changes us, but change isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's transformation. New pathways, new perspectives, new capacities that wouldn't have developed otherwise. She paused, considering her next words carefully. I'm not glad for what Daniel did. Not to those women, not to you, not to us. I would undo it all in a heartbeat if I could. But since I can't, I can acknowledge that surviving him, confronting him, integrating that reality into my understanding of myself, it's made me different than I would have been otherwise. Not damaged, just different. And some of that difference is strength. I squeezed her arm gently, profound gratitude washing through me for this remarkable young woman walking beside me, this daughter who had faced the darkest truth about her origins and emerged not diminished, but enlarged by that confrontation. "You know what the real irony is?" I said as we approached her building. "What's that?" "Daniel's experiment was designed to test whether his darkness would manifest in you genetically, despite my influence as a counterbalance. But what he never considered was that trauma itself, the very trauma his actions caused, might be the catalyst for a different kind of development. Not the emergence of his pathology, but the strengthening of resilience, empathy, and moral clarity in response to that trauma." Cassidy considered this, then nodded slowly. The ultimate failure of his hypothesis. He was so focused on nature versus nurture that he never considered the third factor, choice. The active, ongoing choice to confront darkness rather than succumb to it. To use knowledge for healing rather than harm. As we said goodnight at her door, making plans to meet for breakfast before the second day of the conference, I felt the circle of our journey complete itself. Not ending. We would continue to grow, to evolve, to build new chapters of our lives, but reaching a point of integration that had once seemed impossible. Daniel Blackwood had selected me for my empathy, my protective instincts, my capacity for love, qualities he had seen as exploitable weaknesses. He had intended Cassidy to be his legacy, carrying forward some essence of his nature through her DNA. He had constructed an elaborate experiment designed to test his theories about genetic predisposition to violence against environmental influences. What he could never have anticipated was that the very qualities he had identified and sought to manipulate would become the foundation of our resilience against his influence. That the daughter he had hoped would carry forward his darkness would instead bring light to others, walking similar paths. That the wife he had selected for her vulnerability would find strength precisely in the depths of her capacity to love, to protect, to endure. The secret my daughter had discovered that rainy afternoon, the truth I had kept buried for 23 years, had indeed changed everything, but not in the way either Daniel or I had anticipated. Not as destruction, but as transformation. Not as an ending, but as a beginning. My daughter had whispered, "Why did you keep the secret?" And I had answered, "To save you from your father." But the truth, as we had both discovered, was more complex, more nuanced, more hopeful than either of us had imagined possible. The secret was out. The truth was known. And in that knowing, we had found not shame, but strength. Not limitation, but possibility. Not an inescapable legacy of darkness, but a chosen path of light. As I walked back to my hotel under a sky bright with stars, I felt the future open before me, not erasing the past, but building upon it, not denying what had happened, but transforming it into the foundation for what was yet to come. The whisper had become a declaration. The secret had become a source of wisdom, and the daughter I had tried to save had, in her own way, saved me in return.